one substance held the universe together, not metaphorically, not in the abstract sense that a valuable commodity organized economic activity around its production and distribution. In the functional sense, the operational, mechanical, civilizational sense, that without this substance, the interstellar civilization that governed hundreds of worlds and trillions of inhabitants could not exist. The ships could not travel, the navigators could not navigate, the worlds could not connect, the commerce could not flow, the governance could not reach. The civilization, in the absence of this substance, would fragment into hundreds of isolated worlds whose populations would have no mechanism for the contact the civilization's existence depended on. The substance was the spice Melange, and the story of the spice was the story of everything, the story of the civilization it sustained, the ecology it was produced by, the politics it organized, the consciousness it transformed, the dependency it created, and the vulnerability it imposed on the species that could not live without it. The spice was produced on one world, Arrakis, the desert planet, the most hostile inhabited world in the Imperium, the environment whose conditions killed the unprepared with the efficiency the desert's ecology demanded. The spice was produced on Arrakis and nowhere else. The exclusivity was not commercial, was not the product of a monopoly maintained through legal or military mechanisms. The exclusivity was ecological, was the product of the biological conditions that the spice's production required and that only Arrakis's ecology provided. The exclusivity was the civilization's most consequential fact. Every dimension of the civilization's functioning, the political, the economic, the navigational, the cognitive, the social, was contingent on the ecological conditions of a single planet. The contingency was total. The contingency was fragile. The contingency was the thing that made the spice the most important substance in the known universe, and that made Arrakis the most important piece of real estate in human history. The spice's physical character was the character of a substance whose properties exceeded what the ordinary pharmacological framework could encompass. The melange was cinnamon-coloured. The visual appearance, the warm amber-brown hue the substance presented, was the characteristic the casual encounter identified first. The colour was consistent, was maintained across the concentrations and the preparations the substance was available in, was the visual marker that identified the melange in the commercial contexts the distribution operated in. The scent was the second characteristic. The melange carried a fragrance that the descriptions compared to cinnamon, a warm, aromatic quality that the olfactory perception registered alongside the visual perception the colour provided. The fragrance was present at the concentrations the commercial product maintained and was intensified at the concentrations the heavy consumption produced. The taste was the third characteristic. The melange's flavour, described as pleasant, as desirable, as the quality that made the substance's consumption something the consumers sought rather than something the consumers endured, was the characteristic that made the addiction's initial stages unremarkable. The substance was agreeable. The consumption was pleasant. The pleasure made the dependency's development invisible until the dependency was established. The physical characteristics, the colour, the scent, the taste, were the substance's accessible dimensions, the dimensions the ordinary perception could encounter and assess. The substance's consequential dimensions were the dimensions the ordinary perception could not encounter through the casual consumption, the biochemical effects the sustained consumption produced. The consciousness transformations the concentrated consumption generated, the physiological alterations the long-term consumption imposed, The sandworm life cycle was the mechanism that produced the spice, and the life cycle's examination reveals the ecological architecture the spice's production depended on. The life cycle was a closed system, a self-sustaining biological process whose ongoing operation produced the melange as a byproduct. The system was not designed for the spice's production, was not an engineered process whose purpose was the generation of the substance the civilization consumed. The system was ecological, was the natural operation of the biological organisms the Arrakis ecology encompassed, producing the spice through the biological processes the organism's life cycle involved. The sand trout were the life cycle's larval stage. The small creatures, distinct from the adult sandworms in form and in function, performed the ecological role that the life cycle's continuation depended on, the encapsulation of water. The sand trout sequestered water beneath the desert's surface, sealed the moisture away from the sand, maintained the arid conditions the adult sandworms required for their survival. The sequestration was the life cycle's ecological foundation, the mechanism that maintained the desert as a desert, that prevented the accumulation of surface water that would have transformed the environment into something the adult worms could not inhabit. The water encapsulation was the life cycle's most consequential ecological function. The function maintained the desert maintained the worms produced the spice. The chain of maintenance ran from the sand trout's water sequestration through the desert's preservation, through the worms' survival, through the spice's production. Every link in the chain was necessary. Every link's disruption would have disrupted the chain's subsequent links. The sand trout matured into sandworms. The maturation was the life cycle's developmental progression, the biological transformation from the small water-encapsulating larva to the enormous sand-dwelling creature whose presence dominated the desert's ecology. The transformation's timeline was measured in the biological process's natural duration, was the developmental period the organism's biology required for the maturation's completion. The adult sandworms were the ecology's dominant organisms. The creature's scale was enormous. Lengths that exceeded 400 meters were documented for the larger specimens, scales that made the sandworms the largest organisms the Imperium's biology encompassed. The creatures dwelt in the sand, moved through the desert's subsurface with the movements the sand's medium permitted, traveling in the patterns the ecology's conditions determined. The sandworms were attracted to rhythmic vibrations. The creature's sensory perception detected the patterns the rhythmic disturbances produced in the sand's medium, the thumping that the harvesting equipment's operation generated, the vibrations the human activity on the surface created. The attraction was the ecology's response to the disturbance, was the biological reaction, the sensory perception's detection of the rhythmic pattern produced. The attraction made the harvesting dangerous. The equipment that collected the spice from the sand, the crawlers whose operation extracted the melange from the surface, deposits the life cycle's processes generated, produced the vibrations the worms detected. The detection brought the worms toward the equipment. The worms' approach toward the equipment created the danger the harvesting's logistics had to manage, the danger of the worms' arrival at the collection site while the equipment was still operating. The danger was managed through the carriole system, the aircraft that retrieved the crawlers from the collection sites, that lifted the harvesting equipment away from the sand before the approaching worm reached the equipment's location, were the management's mechanism. The carrioles monitored the sand for the worm's approach signals. The carrioles deployed when the signals indicated the worm's proximity. The carrioles retrieved the crawlers before the worms arrived. The management was imperfect. The system's operation, the monitoring, the deployment, the retrieval was conducted under the conditions the desert imposed and with the equipment the technology provided. The conditions were harsh. The equipment was fallible. The management's imperfection was the harvesting's ongoing risk, the possibility that the retrieval would fail, that the crawler would not be lifted before the worm arrived, that the equipment and the workers would be consumed by the worm the management was designed to protect them from. The risk was the spice production's operational cost, the price the harvesting extracted from the equipment and the personnel the production employed. The cost was accepted because the revenue exceeded the cost by margins that made the acceptance economically rational. The spice was the most valuable substance in the known universe. The production's costs, however significant, were minor fractions of the revenue the production generated. The spice's production mechanism, the biological process through which the life cycle generated the melange, was the mechanism that connected the ecology to the economy. The melange was produced through the interaction between the sand trout's water encapsulation function and the biochemical processes the encapsulation generated. The process was biological, was the operation of the organism's chemistry in the conditions the ecology provided, generating the melange as the byproduct the process's biochemical reactions produced. The melange accumulated in the sand. The substance was deposited by the life cycle's ongoing operations, was generated continuously through the biological process's sustained operation, was accumulated in the sand's medium in concentrations that the harvesting equipment's sensors could detect. The deposits were distributed across the desert's extent, were present wherever the life cycle's biological processes operated, were available for the harvesting's collection wherever the deposit's concentrations exceeded the harvesting's detection thresholds. The spice blows were the deposit's most dramatic manifestation. The geological events, the eruptions of melange saturated sand from beneath the desert's surface, were the events the harvesting operations monitored for and the events the production's most consequential collections were organized around. The spice blows produced the highest concentrations, generated the deposits the harvesting equipment could collect most efficiently, provided the opportunities the production's economic calculations most valued. The blows were also the most dangerous collection events. The eruption scale, the volume of sand displaced, the force of the eruption's geological dynamics produced the conditions that the collection's logistics found most challenging. The scale attracted the worms. The eruption's disturbance, generating the vibrations the worm's sensory perception detected at distances that exceeded the ordinary collection operation's detection ranges. The worm's attraction made the blows collection the operation's most time-pressured activities, the collections that required the most rapid deployment and the most efficient retrieval. The production scale was the scale the civilization's consumption demanded. The melange's distribution, managed through the CHOAM framework's commercial infrastructure, transported by the Guild's navigational service, consumed by the populations whose longevity and cognitive enhancement the spice supported, required the production volumes the harvesting operations were designed to generate. The volumes were large. The Imperium's consumption of the spice was sustained across the civilization's hundreds of worlds, was the ongoing demand of populations whose dietary, medical, cognitive, and navigational consumption maintained the demand levels the production was calibrated to supply. The harvesting operations scale, the number of crawlers deployed, the frequency of the collection activities, the infrastructure the production's logistics maintained, was the scale the demand's satisfaction required. The spice's effects on the human body were the effects that made the substance the civilization's foundation, the biochemical properties whose consequences extended from the individual consciousness to the interstellar civilization's navigational infrastructure. The longevity extension was the effect the broadest population experienced. The Melange's sustained consumption extended the human lifespan, produced the physiological conditions under which the body's aging processes were retarded, the cellular deterioration was slowed. The biological clock that measured the organism's progression toward death was recalibrated to a timeline that exceeded the unassisted biology's parameters. The extension was significant. The Imperium's ruling classes, the noble houses whose wealth provided the sustained spice consumption the extension required, routinely lived for centuries. The extension was not immortality. The spice did not eliminate the aging process, did not halt the biological progression entirely. The spice slowed the progression, reduced the rate at which the organism aged, extended the period during which the organism's functionality was maintained, pushed the death's timing beyond the unassisted biology's schedule. The extension's social consequences were the consequences that shaped the Imperium's political landscape. The rulers who lived for centuries were rulers whose governance encompassed the timescales the longevity provided. Rulers whose political experience accumulated across durations that exceeded the unassisted lifespan's provision, rulers whose institutional memory spanned the decades and the centuries the extension made available. The political landscape's character was shaped by the long lifespans the extension produced, the political maneuvering's timescales, the planning horizons, the strategic calculations. The institutional development's duration were calibrated to the lifespans the spice provided rather than to the lifespans the unassisted biology would have limited. The landscape was slower, was conducted across longer timescales, was managed with the patience the extended lifespans permitted, was organized around the institutional development's multi-century trajectory. The cognitive enhancement was the effect the institutional populations valued most highly. The Melange's consumption enhanced the cognitive functions, expanded the consciousness's processing capability, increased the perception's acuity, developed the analytical capacity the institutional functions the civilization maintained depended on. The enhancement was the foundation of the biological alternatives the prohibition against artificial intelligence had produced, was the biochemical mechanism through which the Mentat's computation, the Bene Gesserit's perception, the Guild Navigator's prescient awareness were supported and sustained. The enhancement operated through the biochemistry, the spice's consumption introduced into the human organism's neural architecture. The Melange's biochemical properties interacted with the neural system's operational chemistry, modified the neurotransmitter dynamics, altered the synaptic processing, changed the neural architecture's functional character in ways that produced the enhanced capabilities the institutional functions required. The interaction was progressive. The sustained consumption produced cumulative effects, each period's consumption building on the previous period's effects, each increment's biochemical contribution adding to the accumulated enhancement the sustained consumption generated. The progression was the enhancement's developmental mechanism, was the process through which the initial consumption's modest effects were developed into the sustained consumption's comprehensive enhancement. The progression was also the addiction's mechanism. The biochemical modifications the sustained consumption produced were modifications the organism could not reverse, were changes in the neural architecture's operational chemistry that the organism's homeostatic mechanisms could not undo. The modifications created the dependency, the physiological condition in which the organism's continued functioning required the continued provision of the substance the modifications depended on. The dependency was fatal to withdraw from. The spice addiction was not the addiction the casual usage of the term described, was not the behavioral dependency the habitual consumption produced. The spice addiction was physiological, was the biochemical condition in which the organism's neural system could not function without the substance the system had been modified to require. The withdrawal was lethal. The cessation of the spice consumption produced the physiological crisis the dependency's absence generated, the neural system's failure, the cognitive function's collapse, the biological death the dependency's disruption imposed. The lethality made the addiction permanent. The person who consumed the spice at the levels the enhancement required was the person who would consume the spice for the remainder of the person's life. The person could not stop. The stopping was the dying. The addiction's permanence was the dependency's most consequential quality, the quality that connected the individual consumption to the civilizational dependency through the mechanism of the individual's inability to cease the consumption the civilization's institutional functions required. The prescient faculty was the spice's most consequential effect. The capability whose activation the sustained consumption could produce in the consciousness the sufficient genetic potential equipped for the activation's experience. Prescience was the perception of the probable future. The capability, developed through the spice saturation's activation of the genetic potential the consciousness carried, was the awareness of the probability space's structure. The perception of the branching futures the space contained, the conscious apprehension of the temporal dimension the ordinary consciousness could only anticipate. The capability was not universally available. The prescient faculty's activation required the genetic potential the activation could operate on, required the neural architecture whose configuration the genetic contribution had produced, required the biological substrate the spice saturation's biochemistry could develop into the prescient perception's operational form. The genetic potential was present in some individuals and absent in others. The presence was the potential. The absence was the limitation. The spice activated the potential where the potential was present. The spice could not create the potential where the potential was absent. The Kwisatz Haderach was the prescient capability's most developed expression. The consciousness whose genetic configuration the Bene Gesserit's breeding program had been designed to produce, and whose prescient faculty encompassed the probability space's full structure. Paul Atreides was the Kwisatz Haderach, the person whose genetic potential the spice saturation activated into the comprehensive prescient awareness the breeding program's design specified. The Guild Navigators were the prescient capability's most sustained institutional expression, the persons whose spice consumption was maintained at the levels the navigational function required, and whose prescient perception was developed through the consumption's sustained operation into the awareness the fold space navigation demanded. The navigator's prescience was navigational, was oriented toward the perception of the fold space paths the navigation required, rather than toward the comprehensive perception of the probability space the Kwisatz Haderach possessed. The prescient faculty's relationship with the spice was the relationship of the activation to the activator. The relationship between the genetic potential's dormant capability and the biochemical substance whose consumption converted the dormancy into the operational form the capability's exercise required. The spice was not the prescience. The spice was the prescience's biochemical catalyst, the substance whose consumption activated the genetic potential into the perceptual capability the potential contained. The activation's permanence paralleled the addiction's permanence. The prescient faculty, once activated, was maintained by the sustained consumption the activation required, was dependent on the continued provision of the spice the neural architecture's modified chemistry demanded. The faculty could not be maintained without the consumption. The consumption could not be ceased without the faculty's loss and the addiction's lethal consequences. The prescience and the addiction were linked with the two consequences of the same biochemical process, the capability and the dependency produced by the same consumption's sustained operation. The link was the spice's most consequential biochemical characteristic, the characteristic that connected the civilization's most valued capability to the civilization's most constraining dependency through the mechanism of the substance that produced both. The spice agony was the ordeal that transformed a Bene Gesserit into a Reverend Mother, and the ordeal's examination reveals the spice's most dramatic biochemical interaction with the human consciousness. The ordeal involved the water of life, the poisonous essence of a drowned sandworm, the substance whose biochemical potency exceeded the raw spice's potency by the margin the concentrations process produced. The water of life was lethal. The substance, consumed without the internal conversion the Bene Gesserit's capabilities made possible, produced the death the substance's toxicity imposed. The conversion was the ordeal. The Bene Gesserit who underwent the spice agony converted the water of life internally, used the prana bindu discipline's biological control to transform the poison's biochemistry from the lethal configuration the substance presented into the catalytic configuration the conversion produced. The transformation was biological, was conducted through the trained control of the body's biochemical processes, was achieved through the conscious management of the internal chemistry the Bene Gesserit's training provided. The conversion's success transformed the consciousness. The catalytic configuration the conversion produced interacted with the consciousness's neural architecture in ways that exceeded the raw spice's cognitive enhancement, produced the access to other memory that the Reverend Mother's capabilities encompassed, opened the ancestral presence's accumulated experience to the consciousness's navigation. Other memory was the conversion's most consequential product. The access to the ancestral presences, the personalities preserved in the genetic memory, carrying the experiential weight of the lives the presences had lived, was the capability the conversion provided. The Reverend Mother could access the female ancestral line, could navigate the matrilineal chain of consciousness, could draw on the accumulated wisdom the ancestral presences contained. The male line was inaccessible. The female Reverend Mother's access to other memory was limited to the female ancestral presences, could not reach the male presences, could not navigate the patrilineal chain the male neurology's architecture encompassed. The limitation was the breeding program's motivation, the limitation that the Kwisatz Haderach's male neurology was designed to overcome, the boundary that the male Bene Gesserit's consciousness was supposed to cross. The spice agony was dangerous. The ordeal's mortality rate, the frequency with which the conversion's attempt failed, and the water of life's toxicity killed the person attempting the conversion, was the ordeal's most consequential risk. The failure was death. The substance's toxicity was the default outcome. The conversion's success was the trained capabilities override of the default. The Bene Gesserit's biological control preventing the death the substance's chemistry would otherwise have produced. Jessica's spice agony was her first attempt. The ordeal conducted in the Fremen sietch during the desert period, in the conditions the desert provided, rather than in the institutional context the Bene Gesserit's management would have preferred, was the ordeal that confirmed Jessica's capability and that transformed her consciousness into the Reverend Mother's access to other memory. The ordeal also affected Aaliyah. The child Jessica was carrying, the daughter who would be born as the pre-born consciousness the water of life's in utero exposure produced, was affected by the ordeal's biochemistry. The water of life's catalytic effects extended through the biological connection that pregnancy maintained, reached the developing consciousness, activated the other memory's access before the developmental protections the ordinary birth provided, produced the pre-born condition the Bene Gesserit's institutional knowledge identified as the abomination's risk. The spice agony was the spice's most dramatic interaction with the human consciousness, the interaction that produced the most consequential transformation the substance's biochemistry could generate. The ordeal demonstrated the spice's capacity for the consciousness's transformation, demonstrated that the substance could, under the right conditions and with the right biological management, produce changes in the consciousness's capabilities that exceeded the sustained consumption's cognitive enhancement by orders of magnitude. The demonstration was the spice's argument about the biological potential the substance could activate. The sustained consumption produced the cognitive enhancement. The spice agony produced the consciousness transformation. The transformation exceeded the enhancement. The exceedance demonstrated the potential, the depth of the biological capability the spice's biochemistry could activate when the activation's conditions were met. The addiction's civilizational dimension was the dimension that connected the individual dependency to the interstellar civilization's structural vulnerability. Every spice consumer was addicted. The consumption that produced the longevity extension, the cognitive enhancement, the institutional capabilities the civilization depended on, every instance of the consumption produced the addiction the consumption's biochemistry generated. The addiction was universal among the consumers, was the condition that every person who consumed the spice at the levels the enhancement required shared. The universality produced the dependency. The civilization whose ruling classes were addicted to the spice was the civilization that could not function without the spice's continued provision. The civilization whose leaders, whose institutions, whose cognitive infrastructure required the substance's sustained supply for the continued operation the governance demanded. The dependency was structural. The dependency was not a policy that could be changed, was not a decision the governance could reverse through the political mechanisms the governance controlled. The dependency was embedded in the biology of the civilization's most consequential persons, was present in the neural architectures of the rulers, the administrators, the navigators, the intelligence operatives, the military commanders, whose addicted organisms required the substance's continued provision. The structural character made the dependency permanent. The civilization could not decide to stop consuming the spice, could not implement the policy decision the addiction's reversal would have required, could not manage the political process the dependency's elimination would have demanded. The dependency was biological rather than political. The biological dependency was not subject to the political decision. The civilization was trapped, was held in the dependency by the biology rather than by the politics, was constrained by the organisms rather than by the institutions. The trap was the spice's most consequential civilizational effect, the effect that made the substance the civilization's vulnerability, as well as the civilization's foundation. The substance that made the civilization possible also made the civilization vulnerable. The possibility and the vulnerability were both the substance's products, were both generated by the same biochemistry, were both consequences of the same consumption, were both dimensions of the same relationship between the substance and the civilization. The spice economy was the Imperium's economic foundation, and the economy's architecture reveals the relationship between the substance and the civilization in its most consequential material dimension. The CHOAM framework, the Combine Honnet Ober-Advancer mercantiles, managed the spices distribution across the Imperium's commercial landscape. The framework was the commercial organization within which the Melange's production, pricing, distribution, and consumption were administered. The institutional infrastructure that connected the harvesting operations on Arrakis to the consumers across hundreds of worlds. The framework's management of the spice was the framework's most consequential function. The melange was Chome's primary commodity, was the substance whose commercial value exceeded the combined value of the framework's other managed commodities, whose revenue constituted the largest component of the framework's commercial output, whose pricing dynamics affected the framework's economic calculations more significantly than any other commodity the framework managed. The pricing was political as well as economic. The spice's price was determined by the supply and demand dynamics the market generated and by the political considerations the pricing's institutional context introduced. The Emperor's Chome shareholding, the largest single shareholding the framework's ownership structure included, gave the throne influence over the pricing decisions the framework's management produced. The influence was exercised alongside the other shareholders' influence, alongside the Landsraad House's collective shareholding, the Guild's commercial participation, the Bene Gesserit's institutional involvement. The pricing's political dimension was the dimension that connected the spice economy to the Imperium's political dynamics. The spice's price affected every institution in the Imperium, affected the Guild's operational costs, the noble house's economic positions, the Bene Gesserit's institutional operations. The population's access to the longevity and the cognitive enhancement the consumption provided. The pricing decisions were political decisions, were determinations whose consequences affected the political landscape's dynamics alongside the economic landscape's markets. The Arrakis fief assignment was the spice economy's most consequential administrative decision, the determination of which noble house would govern the planet whose ecology produced the substance the economy was organized around. The assignment was the Emperor's most valuable political gift, the economic opportunity whose magnitude exceeded what any other fief assignment could provide. The assignment was also the Emperor's most valuable political tool. The house that governed Arrakis controlled the spice production, controlled the harvesting operations, the production volumes, the quality management the commercial distribution required. The control was the most powerful economic position in the Imperium. The assignment of the position was the governance's most consequential act of patronage. The Harkonnen governance of Arrakis had held the assignment for 80 years before the events the saga documented. The governance was exploitative, was conducted according to the Harkonnen institutional tradition's instrumentalist approach, treating the planet as a resource to be harvested rather than as an ecology to be understood. The exploitation was effective, produced the spice volumes the Chome framework required, generated the revenue the Harkonnen House's economic position depended on, maintained the production levels the civilization's consumption demanded. The exploitation was also ignorant. The Harkonnen governance did not understand the ecology the exploitation was operating within, did not comprehend the sandworm life cycle's mechanisms, did not recognize the ecological system the life cycle constituted, did not perceive the ecological conditions the production's continuation depended on. The ignorance was characteristic of the governance tradition, was the consequence of the instrumentalist approach's focus on the production's output rather than on the production's ecological foundations. The Atreides' brief governance of Arrakis, the assignment that Shaddaim's conspiracy had arranged for the Atreides' destruction, would have conducted the governance differently. The Atreides' tradition's governance as service approach would have engaged with the ecology, would have sought the understanding the Harkonnen tradition had not pursued, would have investigated the ecological system that production depended on, would have managed the production within the ecological context the system's continuation required. The governance's destruction, the Harkonnen assault that eliminated the Atreides household, prevented the alternative governance's development. The destruction preserved the exploitative approach, restored the Harkonnen governance to the position the conspiracy had been designed to recover, maintained the ignorant exploitation the Harkonnen tradition provided. The spice's commercial distribution was the distribution that connected the harvesting operations on Arrakis to the consumers across the Imperium's hundreds of worlds. The distribution was conducted through the CHOAM framework's commercial channels, through the trade routes the framework maintained, the commercial relationships the framework managed, the distribution infrastructure the framework's institutional operations provided. The distribution was comprehensive, reached every world the Guild's navigational service connected, served every market the distribution's logistics could access. The distribution's logistics were managed through the transportation the Guild provided. The spice's physical movement, the transport of the Melange from Arrakis to the markets the distribution served, was conducted through the Guild's navigational service, using the fold space, travel, the navigator's prescient perception made safe. The movement was one of the Guild's most consequential transportation functions, was the transport of the substance the Guild's own navigators consumed. The movement of the commodity the Guild's operational existence depended on. The Guild's involvement in the spice distribution was the involvement of a consumer as well as a transporter. The Guild consumed the spice. The Guild transported the spice. The dual role, the consumer who was also the transporter, produced the institutional dynamics the dual role's conflicts of interest generated. The Guild's interest as a consumer was the interest in the supply's reliability and the pricing's favourability. The Guild's interest as a transporter was the interest in the transportation's profitability and the service's compensation. The two interests were not always aligned. The consumer's interest in low prices conflicted with the transporter's interest in high revenues. And the conflicts management was one of the institutional dynamics the Guild's internal governance managed. The distribution's pricing structure reflected the substance's value and the distribution's costs. The Melange's price at the consumption point, the cost the consumer paid for the quantity the consumption required, included the production's costs, the transportation's costs, the CHOAM framework's management's costs, and the margins the distribution's participants extracted. The total cost was significant, was the expense that limited the consumption's access to the populations whose wealth the expense's magnitude required. The access limitation produced the social stratification the spice economy generated. The wealthy consumed the spice, the poor did not, or consumed it at levels insufficient for the enhancement's most consequential effects. The stratification was the spice economy's social consequence, the distribution of the substance's benefits across the population in proportion to the population's wealth rather than in proportion to the population's need. The stratification's political dimension was the dimension that connected the spice economy to the Imperium's social dynamics. The ruling classes, the noble houses, the institutional leadership, the governance's administrative elite consumed the spice at the levels the longevity extension and the cognitive enhancement required. The governed populations, the subjects whose governance the ruling classes conducted, consumed the spice at lower levels or not at all. The differential produced the governance's most consequential social inequality, the inequality of lifespan, of cognitive capability, of the biological advantages the spice consumption provided. The inequality was the spice economy's most consequential social product, the production, through the substance's differential distribution, of a society in which the rulers lived for centuries while the governed lived for decades, in which the rulers' cognitive capabilities exceeded the governed's by the margin the sustained consumption's enhancement produced, in which the biological advantages the substance provided were distributed according to the economic access the wealth determined. The spice's relationship with the guild navigators was the relationship that most directly demonstrated the substance's civilizational significance, the relationship that connected the substance's biochemistry to the civilization's most consequential operational function. The navigators consumed the spice at levels that exceeded what any other institutional consumer required. The consumption was sustained, was maintained at the levels the navigational function demanded across the navigators' operational lifetimes, was the ongoing biochemical input the prescient perception's maintenance required. The consumption transformed the navigators. The sustained, high-concentration spice consumption produced the physiological changes the transformation encompassed. The enlarged cranium, the modified sensory architecture, the altered physiology the sustained consumption generated. The transformation was progressive, was developed across the consumption's sustained operation, was accumulated through the biochemical modifications the consumption's chemistry produced. The transformation was irreversible. The navigators could not return to the pre-transformation physiology, could not reverse the biochemical modifications the sustained consumption had produced, could not restore the biological configuration the pre-consumption organism had maintained. The transformation was permanent. The permanence was the transformation's most consequential quality, the quality that made the navigator's commitment to the navigational function a commitment that could not be withdrawn. The navigator's prescient perception was the transformation's functional product. The perception, the awareness of the fold space paths the navigation required, was the capability the transformation's biochemical modifications produced. The perception was maintained by the consumption's continuation, was dependent on the sustained provision of the spice the perception's biochemistry required, was lost if the consumption was interrupted. The perception's dependence on the consumption connected the navigational function to the spice supply with the directness the operational dependency created. The navigators needed the spice. The navigation needed the navigators. The civilization needed the navigation. The chain of need ran from the spice through the navigators, through the navigation, through the civilization, each link dependent on the preceding link, each link necessary for the succeeding link's operation. The chain was the civilization's circulatory system's dependency. The navigation was the circulatory function, the mechanism that connected the civilization's worlds, that enabled the commerce and the governance and the communication the civilization's functioning required. The navigation depended on the spice. The dependency made the spice the circulatory system's fuel, the substance whose continued provision was necessary for the continued operation of the mechanism that connected the civilization's components into the functioning whole the civilization constituted. The fuel's single source was the circulatory system's vulnerability. The spice was produced on one world. The circulatory system depended on the fuel. The fuel depended on the one world. The circulatory system depended on the one world. The dependency was total. The vulnerability was comprehensive. The disruption of the one world's production would have been the disruption of the circulatory system's operation, which would have been the disruption of the civilization's functioning. The Fremen's relationship with the spice was the relationship that the settled population's commercial relationship obscured, the relationship of the people who inhabited the world the spice was produced on and whose daily existence was conducted in the conditions the spice's ecology generated. The Fremen consumed the spice. Not through the commercial channels the CHOAM framework provided. The Fremen were not the framework's consumers, were not the markets the distribution served. The Fremen consumed the spice through the environmental exposure the desert's conditions imposed, breathed the spice-saturated air the desert's atmosphere contained, ate the food the spice-permeated ecology provided, drank the water the spice's biochemistry had contaminated. The environmental consumption was sustained and comprehensive. The Fremen's entire existence was conducted in the spice-saturated environment the desert maintained, was the sustained lifelong exposure to the Melange's biochemistry that the desert's conditions produced. The exposure was not chosen, was not the deliberate consumption the institutional population's enhancement required. The exposure was environmental, was the consequence of inhabiting the world the spice was produced on, was the unavoidable condition of the existence the desert imposed. The environmental exposure produced the Fremen's characteristics, the blue within blue eyes, the visual marker the spice saturation produced in the eye's colouring, the indicator the sustained exposure generated in the ocular physiology, were the Fremen's most visible physical characteristic. The eyes were the exposure's signature, the physical evidence of the sustained spice consumption the environmental conditions imposed. The exposure also produced the cognitive enhancement the sustained consumption generated. The Fremen's perceptual acuity, the sharpness of the awareness the desert's conditions demanded and the spice's biochemistry supported, was the enhancement the environmental exposure produced. The Fremen were cognitively enhanced, were operating with the expanded awareness the sustained spice exposure generated, were perceiving the environment with the acuity the biochemistry's cognitive effects provided. The enhancement contributed to the Fremen's military capability. The combat awareness, the perceptual sharpness the fighting required, the reflexive responsiveness the combat demanded, was supported by the cognitive enhancement the spice exposure produced. The Fremen were better fighters, in part because the Fremen were cognitively enhanced by the environmental spice saturation the desert provided. The enhancement also contributed to the prescient potential the Fremen population carried. The sustained spice exposure activated the prescient potential in the individuals whose genetic configuration included the potential's presence, produced across the Fremen population the individuals whose prescient capability the environmental exposure had activated. The Sayadinas, the Fremen's spiritual practitioners whose capabilities included the prescient dimension, were the persons whose prescient potential the environmental exposure had developed into the operational form the spiritual function required. Paul's prescient development was supported by the environmental exposure. The spice saturation the desert provided, the sustained, comprehensive, environmentally imposed melange exposure the Fremen existence encompassed, was the biochemical environment in which Paul's prescient capability developed. The development was not produced by the exposure alone. The development required the genetic potential the breeding program had produced. But the development was supported by the exposure, was facilitated by the biochemical conditions the desert's spice saturation provided. The Fremen's relationship with the spice was the relationship of the people who lived inside the substance, who inhabited the ecology the substance was produced by, who breathed the atmosphere the substance contaminated, who consumed the substance through every dimension of the existence the ecology imposed. The Fremen did not use the spice. The Fremen inhabited the spice. The inhabiting was the relationship, the sustained, comprehensive existential engagement with the substance that made the Fremen the substance's most intimately connected population. The water of life was the spice's most concentrated form. The preparation, whose potency exceeded the raw melange's potency by the margin the concentration's biological process produced. The water of life was derived from the sandworm. The process, the drowning of a young sandworm, the collection of the essence the drowning produced, was the biological preparation that converted the raw melange's biochemistry into the concentrated form the water of life constituted. The process was Fremen, was the cultural practice the Fremen maintained for the production of the substance the spiritual tradition's ordeal required. The water of life was lethal. The substance's potency, the concentration of the biochemical compounds the preparation produced, exceeded the human organism's tolerance by the margin the lethality required. The consumption of the water of life without the internal conversion the Bene Gesserit's capabilities provided was the consumption that produced the death the substance's toxicity imposed. The conversion transformed the lethality into the catalyst. The Bene Gesserit, who underwent the spice agony, who consumed the water of life and converted the substance's biochemistry through the prana bindu discipline's biological control, transformed the lethal substance into the catalytic substance the consciousness's transformation required. The transformation was the ordeal's product. Was the consequence of the biological management the Bene Gesserit's training provided for the substance the biological management could convert. The conversion's biochemistry was the spice's biochemistry intensified, was the melange's properties concentrated to the levels the consciousness transformation's activation required. The raw spice produced the cognitive enhancement. The water of life produced the consciousness transformation. The transformation exceeded the enhancement by the margin. The concentration's potency exceeded the raw substance's potency. The relationship between the raw spice and the water of life was the relationship of degree rather than kind, the relationship of the substance at different concentrations, producing effects at different scales through the same biochemical mechanisms at different intensities. The mechanisms were the same. The intensities were different. The different intensities produced the different effects. The enhancement at the raw concentration, the transformation at the concentrated form. The spice's political dimension was the dimension that connected the substance's economic value to the Imperium's governance dynamics, the dimension that made the melange not simply a commodity, but a political instrument whose control conferred the political leverage the control's magnitude provided. The control of the spice production was the control of the civilization's most consequential economic activity. The house that governed Arrakis, that managed the harvesting operations, that determined the production volumes, that oversaw the quality management the commercial distribution required, held the economic position the civilization's dependency made the most powerful position in the Imperium's commercial landscape. The position's power was the power of the dependency's exploitation. The house that controlled the production could influence the supply, could increase or decrease the production volumes, could manage the availability the distribution provided, could affect the pricing the supply and demand dynamics generated. The influence was the leverage, the capacity to affect the conditions the civilization's most consequential persons and institutions depended on. The ability to shape the economic landscape through the management of the substance the landscape was organized around. Shaddam IV understood the position's power. The Emperor's decision to transfer the Arrakis fief from the Harkonnens to the Atreides was informed by the assessment of what the position's power would mean in the hands of the house whose political qualities the Emperor feared. The Atreides on Arrakis, the admired house governing the civilization's most consequential economic asset, would have combined the political capital the Landsraad's admiration provided with the economic leverage the spice control conferred. The combination would have been formidable, would have produced a political position whose strength exceeded what the Corrino dynasty's governance could comfortably manage. The transfer was the trap. The Emperor did not transfer the Arrakis fief to empower the Atreides. The Emperor transferred the fief to position the Atreides for the destruction the conspiracy was designed to accomplish. The position on Arrakis, with the Harkonnen intelligence infrastructure working against them, with the Sardaukars' disguised participation supporting the assault, with the Soup Doctor's broken conditioning providing the inside access, was the position from which the Atreides could be destroyed, while the destruction appeared to be the consequence of the fief's inherent dangers rather than the product of the Emperor's conspiracy. The spice was the bait. The economic opportunity the Arrakis governance represented, the revenue, the commercial position, the political leverage the spice control provided, was the opportunity that made the transfer plausible. The Atreides accepted the transfer because the opportunity was compelling, because the spice control's economic and political benefits were benefits the Atreides' institutional assessment concluded were worth the fief's risks. The acceptance was the trap's activation. The Atreides moved to Arrakis. The conspiracy executed. The household was destroyed. The spice's economic attraction had drawn the Atreides into the position the conspiracy required, had provided the motivation the transfer's acceptance demanded, had served the conspiracy's operational needs by making the Atreides' presence on Arrakis seem like the response to an economic opportunity rather than the entrance into a political ambush. Paul's threat to destroy the spice was the political landscape's most dramatic expression of the substance's leverage, the demonstration that the control of the spice production was the control of the civilization's survival. The threat was made at the battle for Arrakine's political confrontation, at the moment when Paul, at the head of the victorious Fremen army, demanded the terms the military victory made enforceable. The threat said, if the terms are not met, the spice production will be destroyed. The water of death, the substance that could poison the sandworm ecology, that could eliminate the biological system the spice production depended on, would be deployed. The production would end. The spice would cease to be available. The civilization's navigational, economic, and cognitive systems would collapse. The threat worked because the threat was credible. Paul controlled the Water of Death's deployment. Paul controlled the Fremen whose cooperation the deployment required. Paul's prescient vision showed the probability space's confirmation that the deployment would produce the consequences the threat described. The credibility was comprehensive, the threat's execution was within the threatener's capability, the threat's consequences were within the threat's described parameters, the threat's resolution required the compliance the threat demanded. The threat's credibility demonstrated the spice's civilizational leverage in its most concentrated form. The person who could credibly threaten the spice's destruction was the person who held the civilization hostage, who could compel the civilization's institutional actors to comply with the person's demands, because the alternative to compliance was the civilization's navigational and economic collapse. The hostage-taking worked. Shaddam accepted Paul's terms. The dynasty ended. The throne changed hands. The 10,000-year political order was overturned because the person who threatened the spice's destruction could not be opposed by the civilization that depended on the spice's continuation. The episode demonstrated the spice's political character in its most dramatic form. The substance that made the civilization possible was the substance that made the civilization vulnerable. The civilization could not function without the spice. The person who could credibly threaten the spice could compel the civilization's compliance. The dependency was the vulnerability. The vulnerability was the leverage. The leverage was the power. The spice's role in the jihad was the role of the fuel, the substance whose continued availability sustained the military operations the religious mobilization produced. The Fremen armies that fought the jihad across the known universe were armies whose logistics included the spice's provision. The warriors consumed the spice, maintained the addiction the environmental exposure on Arrakis had established, sustained the cognitive enhancement the combat capability depended on, continued the consumption the physiological dependency required. The provision was managed through the logistics the jihad's military operations maintained. Through the supply chains the military's administrative apparatus sustained, through the distribution mechanisms the army's operational requirements generated. The provision was reliable. The Fremen controlled Arrakis, controlled the production, controlled the substance whose distribution the army's logistics managed. The jihad's military capability was supported by the spice's effects. The Fremen warriors' combat effectiveness, the perceptual acuity, the reflexive responsiveness, the cognitive sharpness the combat demanded was sustained by the enhancement the spice consumption maintained. The warriors were better fighters because they were spice-enhanced fighters. Because the substance's biochemistry supported the cognitive functions the combat's demands required. The jihad's extension across the known universe was the spice economy's disruption across the known universe. The military operations the jihad conducted affected the commercial relationships the CHOAM framework maintained, disrupted the trade routes the distribution used, affected the pricing dynamics the supply and demand generated, changed the economic conditions the commercial landscape operated in. The disruption was the jihad's economic dimension. The economic consequences the military operations produced alongside the military consequences the operations were designed to generate. The economic disruption affected the spice's availability, affected the distribution's reliability, the pricing's stability, the access the population's consumption depended on. The jihad's economic disruption was one of the conflict's least documented but most consequential dimensions. The killing was documented, the 61 billion dead, the 90 worlds devastated. The economic disruption was less documented, the commercial relationships disrupted. The distribution channels affected, the pricing dynamics destabilized. The disruption's consequences extended beyond the jihad's military timeline, persisted into the post-jihad governance's economic landscape, affected the commercial recovery the governance's administrative apparatus managed. The spice's role in Paul's governance was the role of the foundation. The substance whose continued production and distribution the governance's economic dimension depended on, and whose management the governance's administrative apparatus prioritized. Paul governed from Arrakis. The governance's seat was the substance's source, was the planet whose ecology produced the melange the governance's economic system required. The proximity was political as well as administrative, was the expression of the governance's relationship with the substance the governance depended on. The demonstration that the governance's center was the substance's center. The governance managed the spice production with the attention the production's significance required. The harvesting operations were maintained, were conducted with the regularity the production volumes demanded, were managed with the efficiency the commercial distribution required, were sustained across the governance's 12-year duration with the consistency the economic system depended on. The management was competent. The spice production's volumes were maintained at the levels the CHOAM framework required. The distribution's logistics were managed with the reliability the commercial channels demanded. The pricing's dynamics were calibrated to the governance's economic objectives. The management was the governance's economic foundation, was the economic activity whose successful operation sustained the governance's institutional requirements. The management was also the governance's dependencies expression. The governance that managed the spice production was the governance that depended on the spice production, was the governance whose economic functioning required the production's continuation, whose institutional operations consumed the substance the production generated, whose political stability depended on the economic conditions the production's management maintained. The dependency was present in every dimension of the governance's operation. The navigational dependency, the guild's requirement for the spice the navigators consumed, was present in the governance's transportation dimension. The cognitive dependency, the institutional population's requirement for the enhancement the consumption provided, was present in the governance's administrative dimension. The longevity dependency, the ruling class's requirement for the lifespan extension the sustained consumption generated, was present in the governance's social dimension. The dependencies were the governance's constraints. The governance operated within the dependency's parameters, could manage the dependency's conditions, but could not eliminate the dependencies themselves, could administer the dependency's consequences, but could not reverse the dependency's causes. The governance was conducted inside the dependencies rather than above them. The spice's connection to the ecological crisis was the connection that linked the substance's production to the Fremen's terraforming dream, and that demonstrated the tension between the civilization's dependency and the indigenous population's aspiration. The terraforming program, Pardot Kynes' design for the progressive greening of Arrakis, was the program whose success would destroy the spice production's ecological foundation. The program introduced moisture into the desert. The moisture threatened the sandworm life cycle. The life cycle's disruption would end the spice production. The production's end would collapse the civilization's navigational and economic systems. The tension was irreconcilable. The Fremen wanted the green world. The civilization needed the desert world. The green world's achievement required the desert's elimination. The desert's elimination would end the spice. The spice's end would collapse the civilization. The Fremen's aspiration and the civilization's dependency were organized around opposite ecological conditions, each requiring the other's absence. The tension was present throughout the saga's documented timeline, was the ongoing dynamic that connected the substance's production to the planet's ecological trajectory, that linked the civilization's navigational and economic systems to the ecological conditions the indigenous population was progressively modifying. The tension's management was conducted differently in each era the saga documented. In the pre-Paul era, the tension was unmanaged. The Harkonnen governance did not know about the terraforming program, did not perceive the ecological modification the program was producing, did not recognize the threat the modification posed to the production the governance was managing. In Paul's era, the tension was acknowledged. Paul's prescient vision perceived the terraforming's trajectory, the ecological crisis's approach, the production's eventual decline the trajectory would generate. The acknowledgement was present in the governance's awareness. The management was not present in the governance's actions. 12 years of Paul's governance did not include the comprehensive ecological management the tension's resolution required. In the God Emperor's era, the tension was managed. Leto II's comprehensive governance included the ecological management the tension's calibration required, the sustained attention to the desert's conditions, and the terraforming's progress that the production's continuation demanded. In the post-God Emperor era, the tension was resolved through the ecology's transformation, the desert's progressive recovery, driven by the sand trout's regeneration, producing the conditions the spice production required through the ecology's natural mechanisms rather than through the governance's managed calibration. The tension's progression across the timeline was the spice's ecological story, the story of the substance's production's relationship with the planet's ecological trajectory, told through the management and the non-management and the recovery that the timeline's eras provided. The God Emperor's management of the spice was the most comprehensive management the substance had received across the saga's documented timeline, the management whose comprehensiveness reflected the God Emperor's comprehensive governance and whose duration reflected the governance's 3,500-year span. Leto II controlled the spice. The control was personal, was exercised by the God Emperor's authority rather than by the institutional mechanisms the previous governance had employed. Leto determined the production volumes. Leto determined the distribution. Leto determined the availability. The substance that had been managed through the CHOAM framework's commercial infrastructure was managed through the God Emperor's personal authority, was administered as the personal resource of the ruler, whose comprehensive governance encompassed every dimension of the civilization's institutional landscape. The personal control was the political control. Leto used the spice as a tool of the governance, used the substance's distribution as the mechanism through which the governance's political objectives were pursued, calibrated the availability to the political consequences the availability's conditions generated. The guild received the spice at the levels the God Emperor determined. The Bene Gesserit received the spice at the levels the God Emperor permitted. The populations received the spice at the levels the God Emperor's management specified. The management was authoritarian. The substance that had been distributed through the commercial mechanisms the CHOAM framework maintained was distributed through the governance's personal authority, was allocated by the ruler rather than by the market, was provided by the governance rather than by the commerce, was managed by the comprehensive authority rather than by the commercial dynamics. The authoritarianism served the golden path. The spice's management, like every other dimension of the God Emperor's governance, was calibrated to the golden path's requirements, was conducted in service of the 3,500-year project the governance was designed to accomplish. The management maintained the spice supply at the levels the project required, maintained the availability's conditions in the configurations the Golden Path's timeline specified. The management included the ecological dimension. Leto managed the sandworm ecology alongside the spice production, maintained the ecological conditions the production depended on, calibrated the terraforming's progress to the pace the Golden Path required, managed the environmental balance between the desert's preservation and the transformation's progression with the comprehensive attention the God Emperor's consciousness provided. The ecological management was the management's most consequential dimension. The previous governance, the Carino dynasty, Paul's reign, the Regency, had not managed the ecology with the comprehensiveness the ecology's preservation required. The God Emperor managed it comprehensively, attended to the sandworm population's maintenance, to the desert conditions' preservation, to the ecological balance the production's continuation depended on. The management's comprehensiveness was the management's achievement and the management's cost. The achievement was the production's sustained operation, the 3,500-year continuation of the spice supply through the ecological management the God Emperor provided. The cost was the authoritarianism the comprehensiveness required, the personal control, the institutional subordination, the freedom's compression that the governance's comprehensiveness imposed. The God Emperor's death disrupted the spice supply with the comprehensiveness the death's ecological consequences produced. The sand trout that had been Leto's skin dispersed into the environment. The dispersal was the beginning of the ecological transition, the period during which the sandworm ecology's biological components reorganized themselves in the conditions the God Emperor's death had created. The transition was not instantaneous, was measured in decades and centuries rather than in years, was the ecological process's natural timeline rather than the governance's managed schedule. The transition disrupted the spice production. The ecological conditions that the production depended on, the desert's aridity, the sandworm population's presence, the life cycle's biological operations, were disrupted by the transition's progression. The disruption reduced the production, reduced the volumes the harvesting operations could generate, reduced the availability the distribution could provide, reduced the supply the civilization's consumption required. The reduction produced the famine times. The spice shortage that the ecological transition generated was the shortage whose consequences affected every dimension of the civilization's functioning: the navigational dimension, the economic dimension, the cognitive dimension, the social dimension. The shortage was comprehensive, was present in every market the distribution served, was experienced by every population the consumption supported, was felt in every institution the enhancement sustained. The famine times were the spice's absence made civilizational. The substance whose presence sustained the civilization was the substance whose absence disrupted the civilization. The disruption was the dependency's consequence, was the result the dependency produced when the dependency's object was reduced, was the outcome the structural vulnerability generated when the vulnerability's condition was realized. The guild's navigational capability was degraded. The navigator's spice consumption, maintained at the levels the navigational function required across the millennia of the civilization's navigational history, was reduced by the shortage's constraints. The reduced consumption degraded the navigational perception, reduced the prescient awareness the navigation required, diminished the fold space path perception the navigation depended on. The degraded navigation reduced the interstellar connections, the worlds that had been connected by the navigational service, connected through the fold space travel the navigator's prescient perception made safe, were connected less reliably as the navigation's degradation reduced the service's capability. The reduced connections isolated worlds, produced the geographic fragmentation the political landscape's fragmentation reflected. The political fragmentation was the famine times political expression. The political unity the previous governance had maintained, the centralized administration the Carino dynasty and the God Emperor had provided, could not be sustained without the navigational connections the spice supplies reliability had maintained. The unity fragmented. The political landscape broke into the competing territories and the competing institutions the governance's absence and the navigation's degradation produced. The fragmentation was the scattering's precondition. The populations whose political unity had been maintained by the governance and the navigation experienced the fragmentation as the liberation the God Emperor's death had provided, experienced the disconnection from the central governance as the freedom the governance's compression had denied. The liberation and the disconnection were the same condition, the condition of the governance's absence, experienced as freedom by the populations whose governance had been oppressive, and as isolation by the populations whose governance had been connective. The scattering was the freedom's expression. The populations that dispersed into the uncharted territories were the populations whose liberation from the governance produced the hunger for the movement the governance had denied. The hunger was the God Emperor's design, was the condition the 3,500-year compression had been designed to produce, was the motivation the governance's oppression had cultivated for the dispersal the species' survival required. The dispersed populations carried the spice addiction. The persons whose consumption the environmental exposure and the institutional provision had established carried the dependency into the territories the scattering reached, carried the biochemical requirement into the conditions the unknown territories provided. The dependency accompanied the dispersal. The dependency demanded the provision. The provision's absence in the unknown territories was the dependency's crisis. The crisis the dispersed populations had to address in the conditions the territory's ecology provided. The spice supply's recovery was the God Emperor's final gift, the biological contribution of the sand trout from the God Emperor's body to the ecology the recovery would restore. The sand trout dispersed from the dying hybrid's body. The larval organisms entered the environment, began the water encapsulation process the life cycle's ecological function required, started the progressive aridification the desert conditions restoration demanded. The process was the life cycle's natural operation, was the biological system's self-sustaining mechanism performing the function the mechanism was designed to perform. The recovery was gradual. The sand trout's maturation, the developmental progression from the larval form to the adult sandworm, was measured in the biological timescales the organism's development required. The progression was not instantaneous. The progression was biological, was conducted at the pace the organism's biology determined rather than at the pace the civilization's needs demanded. The gradualness produced the famine time's duration. The spice supply's recovery proceeded at the pace the ecology's restoration permitted, was limited by the ecological conditions' progressive re-establishment, was constrained by the biological processes' natural timelines. The recovery was happening. The recovery was not happening quickly enough for the civilization's immediate needs. The eventual recovery restored the spice supply to the levels the reduced civilization's demands required. The sandworm population grew. The life cycle's operations resumed. The spice production's biological processes generated the melange the harvesting operations could collect. The supply was restored, not to the levels the pre-famine time civilization had consumed, but to the levels the post-famine time civilization required. The restoration was the ecology's resilience demonstrated, the demonstration that the sandworm life cycle's self-sustaining mechanism could regenerate from the biological material the God Emperor's death had provided, could restore the conditions the production required through the mechanism's own operation, could produce the recovery the civilization needed through the natural processes the mechanism encompassed. The chapter house transplantation was the spice's most consequential geographic event, the first establishment of the sandworm ecology on a world other than Arrakis, and the first diversification of the spice supply's geographical concentration. The Bene Gesserit introduced sandworms to chapter house. The introduction, the transplantation of the sandworm ecology's biological components to the sisterhood's institutional base was the institutional decision that addressed the spice supply's geographical concentration by establishing the production's ecological foundation on a second world. The transplantation was ecological rather than industrial. The sisterhood did not construct a spice production facility on Chapter House, did not build the infrastructure the harvesting operations on Arrakis employed. The sisterhood introduced the ecology, planted the biological organisms whose life cycle would, through the life cycle's natural operation, produce the spice the sisterhood's institutional consumption required. The introduction required the environmental modification. The sandworm ecology's operation required the desert conditions the life cycle maintained, required the aridity the sandtrout's water encapsulation produced, the sand the adult worm's movement required, the environmental character the desert the life cycle constituted. The introduction of the ecology to Chapter House meant the introduction of the desert to Chapter House. The progressive transformation of the planet's environment from whatever conditions the planet originally maintained toward the desert conditions the sandworm ecology required. The transformation was progressive. The sandtrout's water encapsulation, the ecological function the larval organisms performed, progressively aridified the environment the introduction had placed the organisms in. The aridification was the desert's creation, the progressive conversion of the non-desert conditions into the desert conditions the adult worms required. The conversion was the ecology's operation, was the life cycle's natural function performing the environmental modification the life cycle's continuation demanded. The sisterhood accepted the transformation. The institutional decision to introduce the ecology was the decision to accept the environmental consequences the ecology's operation would produce, the decision that the spice production's institutional benefit justified the environmental transformation's institutional cost. The acceptance was the trade-off's resolution, the determination that the spice's availability was worth the planet's progressive desertification. The trade-off was the mirror of the Fremen's terraforming dream. The Fremen were transforming a desert into a green world, were pursuing the ecological modification that would eliminate the desert conditions the spice production required. The Bene Gesserit were transforming a green world into a desert, were pursuing the ecological modification that would establish the desert conditions the spice production required. The two modifications were opposite in direction and identical in principle. Both were the deliberate modification of a planet's ecological conditions in service of the institution's objectives. Both were the acceptance of the environmental transformation's consequences for the institutional benefit the transformation provided. The transplantation was the geographical concentration's first breach. The spice had been produced on one world. The transplantation established the production on a second world. The establishment was the beginning of the diversification the geographical concentration's vulnerability demanded, the first step in the reduction of the single-source dependency the civilization's navigational and economic systems had been organized around. The diversification was incomplete. The transplantation established the production on one additional world. The civilization's vulnerability required the diversification across multiple worlds, required the establishment of the production on enough worlds that the disruption of any single world's production could not collapse the civilization's supply. The single additional world was not sufficient for the comprehensive diversification the vulnerability required. The incompleteness was the diversification's limitation, the constraint that the transplantation's single instance imposed on the concentration's reduction. The limitation was addressed by Shiinia's departure, the carrying of sandworms aboard the no-ship into the unknown territories, the distribution of the ecology's biological foundation beyond the old Imperium's boundaries. The departure extended the diversification, provided the ecology's components to whatever destinations the no-ship reached, established the production's potential in the territories the departure's trajectory encompassed. The spice's relationship with the Ixian navigation machines was the relationship that most directly threatened the substance's civilizational centrality. The relationship between the biological navigation the spice sustained and the mechanical navigation the Ixian engineering was developing. The navigation machines were the Ixian tradition's most consequential development in the spice's dimension. The machines, the mechanical devices designed to replicate the navigator's prescient perception through technological rather than biological means, with a technology whose completion would have provided the navigational function without the spice consumption the biological navigation required. The machine's availability would have changed the spice's civilizational position. The substance's centrality depended on the navigational function's dependency, depended on the navigator's consumption as the mechanism through which the interstellar travel's safety was maintained. The machine's provision of the navigational function through mechanical means would have eliminated the navigational dependency, would have removed the link between the navigation and the spice that the substance's civilizational centrality was organized around. The elimination would not have eliminated the spice's value. The substance's other effects, the longevity extension, the cognitive enhancement, the consciousness transformation, were effects whose value was independent of the navigational function's biological provision. The spice would have remained valuable for the effects the consumption produced. The spice would have been less central, would have been a valuable commodity rather than the foundation of the civilization's navigational infrastructure. The reduction from foundation to commodity would have been the spice's most consequential commercial transformation. The reduction of the substance from the civilizational necessity the current economy treated it as to the commercial product the future economy would treat it as. The reduction would have affected every dimension of the spice economy, would have changed the pricing, the distribution, the political leverage, the institutional dynamics the economy's current architecture encompassed. The reduction was the Guild's most feared development. The Guild's institutional position depended on the navigational monopoly, depended on the exclusive provision of the navigational function through the biological means the spice sustained. The machine's provision of the function through mechanical means would have broken the monopoly, would have eliminated the exclusive provision the Guild's institutional position was organized around. The Guild's opposition to the machine's development was the opposition of the institution whose survival the development threatened, the institutional resistance to the technological change whose completion would have reduced the institution's position from the monopoly provider to the competitive provider. The opposition was sustained, was maintained across the decades and the centuries of the machine's development's timeline, was deployed through the political mechanisms the Guild's institutional leverage provided. The opposition was ultimately unsuccessful. The machine's development proceeded, was sustained by the Ixian tradition's institutional commitment to the technological advancement the Prohibition's boundary permitted, was supported by the economic demand for the navigational alternative the machines would provide. The development's pace was slow, was constrained by the engineering challenges the machine's design presented, was delayed by the political resistance the Guild's opposition imposed. But the development proceeded. The machine's eventual availability, the point at which the technology's development produced the functional navigation the machines were designed to provide, would have been the spice economy's most consequential transformation. The transformation was referenced in the saga's later novels as a development in progress rather than as a development completed, a future rather than a present, a potential rather than a reality. The potential was the spice's future, the future in which the substance's civilizational centrality was reduced by the alternative the technology provided. The future was not the substance's elimination, was not the disappearance of the spice from the civilization's economy. The future was the substance's repositioning, the change from the foundation to the commodity, from the necessity to the luxury, from the thing the civilization could not function without to the thing the civilization valued but could potentially manage without. The spice's philosophical dimension was the dimension that connected the substance's narrative function to the saga's deepest concerns about the relationship between human civilization and the resources the civilization depended on. Herbert constructed the spice as the argument about dependency, the fictional expression of the argument that a civilization organized around a single resource was a civilization whose sophistication was accompanied by a fragility the sophistication obscured. The argument was not abstract. The argument was embedded in the narrative's structure, was expressed through the consequences the dependency produced, through the vulnerabilities the dependency created, through the political and ecological dynamics the dependency generated. The argument's core was the relationship between the resource and the civilization. The resource made the civilization possible. The civilization organized itself around the resource. The organization produced the dependency. The dependency produced the vulnerability. The vulnerability threatened the civilization. The civilization could not address the vulnerability without addressing the dependency. The civilization could not address the dependency without reorganizing itself away from the resource. The reorganization was the change the civilization's existing architecture resisted. The resistance was the argument's political dimension. The institutions whose positions depended on the resource's centrality, the guild, whose monopoly the spice sustained, the noble houses, whose economic positions the spice trade maintained, the governance, whose administrative operations the spice revenue funded, were the institutions whose resistance to the reorganization the dependency's address required was the most sustained. The resistance was institutional, was generated by the institutional interests the current arrangement served, was maintained by the institutional leverage the current arrangement provided. The resistance was also personal. The individuals whose addictions the consumption had established, the rulers, the administrators, the navigators. The institutional operators whose bodies required the substance's continued provision were the individuals whose resistance to the dependency's address was the most immediate. The resistance was biological, was generated by the addiction the consumption had produced, was maintained by the physiological dependency the addiction constituted. The institutional and the personal resistance combined to produce the dependency's persistence. The sustained continuation of the arrangement the dependency constituted, maintained by the combination of the institutional leverage and the biological necessity the arrangement generated. The persistence was the dependency's most consequential quality, the quality that made the dependency self-sustaining, that made the arrangement the dependency constituted resistant to the change the vulnerability demanded. The commentary on oil was the commentary Herbert's contemporaries recognized in the spice's construction. The parallel between the fictional substance the interstellar civilization depended on and the actual substance the industrial civilization the saga's readers inhabited depended on. The parallel was deliberate. Herbert constructed the spice with the awareness that the substance's fictional properties corresponded to the properties the petroleum economy's dynamics demonstrated. The single source dependency. The political leverage the control of the source provided. The institutional resistance to the alternative the dependency's vulnerability demanded. The ecological consequences the production's operations generated. The correspondence was not exact. The spice was not oil, the substance's biochemical properties, its consciousness transforming effects, its role in the interstellar navigation had no petroleum equivalent. The correspondence was structural, was the parallel between the dependency's architecture rather than between the substance's properties, was the similarity in the political and economic and ecological dynamics the dependencies produced rather than in the biochemical or industrial functions the substances served. The structural parallel was the commentary's content. Herbert was not arguing that the spice was oil. Herbert was arguing that the dependency dynamics the spice demonstrated were the dependency dynamics the oil economy demonstrated. that the vulnerability the fictional civilization experienced through its spice dependency was the vulnerability the actual civilization experienced through its petroleum dependency. The argument said, the civilization that organizes itself around a single resource is the civilization that makes itself vulnerable to the resource's disruption. The argument said, the institutional resistance to the alternative is the resistance that maintains the vulnerability. The argument said, the biological and the institutional dimensions of the dependency combine to produce the persistence that makes the vulnerability structural rather than contingent. The argument's application to the petroleum economy was the application Herbert's construction invited, the assessment that the actual civilization's petroleum dependency produced the same dynamics the fictional civilization's spice dependency produced, that the vulnerability and the resistance and the persistence were present in the actual economy as they were present in the fictional economy. The invitation was the saga's engagement with the reader's world, the connection between the fictional universe and the actual universe that the spice's construction provided. The engagement was not prescriptive, did not tell the reader what to do about the petroleum dependency the parallel identified. The engagement was diagnostic, identified the dependency's dynamics, documented the dynamics' consequences, demonstrated the dynamics' persistence. The diagnosis was the engagement's content. The prescription was the reader's responsibility. The consciousness dimension of the spice was the dimension that distinguished the substance from the petroleum parallel, and that connected the substance to the saga's argument about consciousness rather than about economics. The spice transformed consciousness. The substance did not simply fuel the civilization's economic and navigational operations. The substance changed the persons who consumed it, altered the consciousness the consumption affected, transformed the human mind's capabilities through the biochemistry the consumption introduced. The transformation was the spice's most consequential property, the property that made the substance more than a resource, that made the Melange's role in the civilization more than the role of a fuel or a commodity. The spice was the substance that expanded human consciousness, that developed the human mind's capabilities beyond the mind's unassisted baseline. That produced the prescient awareness, the cognitive enhancement, the consciousness expansion the saga's institutional capabilities depended on. The expansion connected the spice to the prohibition's argument. The prohibition said, develop the biological rather than the artificial. The spice was the biochemical mechanism through which the biological development was facilitated. Was the substance whose consumption activated the genetic potential the biological development encompassed. Was the catalyst that converted the dormant capability into the operational form the institutional functions required. The prohibition and the spice were the two dimensions of the civilization's cognitive strategy. The prohibition specified the direction, biological rather than artificial. The spice provided the means, the biochemical catalyst that facilitated the biological development the prohibition directed. The two dimensions were complementary, with the direction and the means operating together to produce the cognitive architecture the civilization maintained. The complementarity raised the question the saga's argument about the spice encompassed. Was the spice facilitated development truly biological? The question addressed the distinction between the biological development the prohibition mandated and the chemically facilitated development the spice provided. The biological development that the prohibition's argument endorsed was the development of the human mind's capabilities through training, through the sustained, institutional, knowledge-intensive cultivation of the capabilities the biology contained. The spice-facilitated development was the development through chemistry, through the substance's biochemical activation of the capabilities that genetics provided. The distinction between training and chemistry was the distinction the question addressed. The training was the development through effort, through the sustained practice the capabilities refinement required. The chemistry was the development through consumption, through the substance's provision of the biochemical conditions the capabilities activation demanded. The training and the chemistry were both biological, both operated through the biological mechanisms the human organism's architecture encompassed. But the training was active, required the person's effort, demanded the practice's sustained investment. The chemistry was passive, required the substance's consumption, demanded the provision's sustained supply. The passivity was the dependency's source. The development that depended on the substance's consumption was the development that required the substance's continued provision, was the development whose maintenance was contingent on the supply's reliability rather than on the person's continued effort. The training-based development was self-sustaining, was maintained by the person's continued practice regardless of the external supply's conditions. The chemistry-based development was supply-dependent, was maintained by the substance's continued consumption regardless of the person's internal capabilities. The dependency connected the consciousness expansion to the civilizational vulnerability. The expanded consciousness depended on the spice. The spice depended on the ecology. The ecology depended on the planet. The chain of dependency ran from the expanded consciousness through the substance, through the ecology, through the planet, each link contingent on the preceding link's continued operation. The chain was the vulnerability's architecture. The consciousness expansion, the civilization's most valued cognitive achievement, was vulnerable to the ecology's disruption through the substance the expansion depended on. The disruption of the ecology would disrupt the substance. The disruption of the substance would disrupt the expansion. The disruption of the expansion would disrupt the civilization's cognitive capabilities. The vulnerability was the spice's paradox. The substance that expanded consciousness was the substance that made consciousness vulnerable. The expansion and the vulnerability were both the substance's products, were both generated by the same consumption, were both consequences of the same dependency. The consciousness was expanded. The consciousness was also fragile. The expansion and the fragility coexisted in the same relationship with the same substance. The spice's argument about resource dependency extended beyond the economic and the consciousness dimensions to the ecological dimension. The argument about the relationship between the civilization and the ecology the civilization's resource depended on. The ecological argument said, the civilization that depends on a resource depends on the ecology that produces the resource. The civilization's relationship with the resource is the civilization's relationship with the ecology, is the connection between the civilization's needs and the ecological conditions the need satisfaction requires. The connection was present in the spice's case with the directness the dependency's totality produced. The civilization depended on the spice. The spice depended on the sandworm life cycle. The life cycle depended on the desert conditions. The desert conditions depended on the sand trout's water encapsulation. The chain of ecological dependency was the chain that connected the civilization's navigational and economic and cognitive systems to the biological processes of organisms on a single desert planet. The chain's visibility was the argument's purpose. Herbert constructed the chain with the visibility the argument required, made the ecological dependencies clear. made the biological process's role in the civilization's functioning evident, made the connection between the civilization and the ecology, the substance sustained, visible to the reader's assessment. The visibility was the argument's method. The reader could see the chain. The reader could assess the chain's fragility. The reader could evaluate the vulnerability the chain produced. The reader could apply the assessment to the reader's civilization's dependencies, could evaluate the actual civilization's ecological chains with the analytical framework the fictional civilization's chain provided. The application was the argument's purpose. Herbert was not simply constructing a fictional ecology. Herbert was constructing a model of the relationship between civilization and ecology that the reader could apply to the reader's world. The model said, look at your civilization's dependencies. Look at the ecological chains your dependencies create. Look at the fragilities the chains produce. The fictional chain was the model. The actual chains were the application. The spice's role across the saga's full timeline was the role of the constant, the substance that was present in every era the saga documented, whose significance was maintained across every transition the timeline encompassed, whose properties remained the same even as the civilization the substance sustained was transformed by the events the substance's significance contributed to. The constancy was the spice's narrative function. The substance was the thing that connected the saga's eras, the element whose presence in every era provided the continuity the narrative's progression required. The eras were different: the Carino dynasty, Paul's governance, the God Emperor's management, the post-scattering fragmentation. The spice was the same. The substance's properties were unchanged across the eras. The substance's significance was maintained across the transitions. The constancy was the thread, the narrative element whose continuity connected the eras, the element's variations distinguished. The constancy was also the argument's vehicle. The substance that was the same across every era demonstrated the dependency's persistence across every era, demonstrated that the civilization's relationship with the substance was maintained regardless of the civilization's political, institutional, and social transformations. The governance changed. The dependency did not. The institutions changed. The dependency did not. The political order changed. The dependency did not. The persistence demonstrated the dependency's structural character. The dependency was not a feature of any particular governance or any particular institutional arrangement. The dependency was a feature of the civilization's architecture, was embedded in the civilization's navigational, economic, and cognitive systems at a level that the governance's changes did not reach. The dependency was deeper than the governance. The dependency was deeper than the institutions. The dependency was at the civilization's foundation. The depth was the argument's most consequential dimension. The argument said the dependencies are deeper than the politics. The dependencies are maintained by the civilization's architecture rather than by the civilization's governance. The governance can change without the dependencies changing. The institutions can change without the dependencies changing. The dependencies persist because the dependencies are structural rather than political. The structural persistence was the vulnerability's permanence. The vulnerability that the dependency produced was the vulnerability that the governance's changes could not address, was the vulnerability embedded in the civilization's architecture at the level the governance's changes did not reach. The vulnerability was permanent, was maintained across every transition, was present in every era, was the constant that the spice's constancy both sustained and demonstrated. The spice's significance in the saga's final documented events was the significance of a substance whose civilizational role was being challenged by the developments the saga's later eras produced. The Ixian navigation machines challenged the navigational dependency. The machine's development, the progressive engineering of the mechanical navigation that could potentially replace the biological navigation the spice sustained, was the technological challenge to the spice's navigational centrality. The chapter house transplantation challenged the geographical concentration, the establishment of the sandworm ecology on a second world, and Chiina's departure with sandworms aboard the No ship was the ecological challenge to the spice's geographical monopoly. The scattering challenged the civilizational dependency, the dispersal of populations into the unknown territories, populations whose spice addictions accompanied the dispersal and whose access to the substance's supply was uncertain in the territories the dispersal reached, was the demographic challenge to the dependency's universal management. The challenges were the saga's final documented engagement with the spice's civilizational role, the engagement that suggested the substance's centrality was not permanent, that the dependency's persistence was not indefinite, that the civilization's architecture's structural features could be modified by the developments the civilization's ongoing operation produced. The suggestions were the saga's hope. The dependency could be addressed. The vulnerability could be reduced. The concentration could be diversified. The architecture could be modified. The suggestions did not document the modification's completion, did not show the reader the civilization's post-dependency condition. The suggestions showed the reader the modification's beginning, showed the developments that were producing the changes the dependency's address required. The beginnings were sufficient for the argument's completion. The argument said, the dependency is structural, the dependency is persistent, the dependency is vulnerable. The argument also said, the dependency can be addressed. The developments are beginning, the changes are proceeding. The civilizational architecture is being modified by the developments the civilization's operation produces. The argument's completion was the hope's expression. The civilization that was dependent could become the civilization that was diversified. The transition was happening. The transition was not complete. The transition's incompleteness was the saga's acknowledgement that the modification of the civilizational architecture was a process measured in centuries rather than in years, a process whose completion the saga's documented timeline did not encompass. The spice melange was the substance that changed humanity. The statement was not metaphorical. The substance changed the species, changed the consciousness the species possessed, changed the capabilities the species could exercise, changed the civilization the species maintained. The changes were produced by the substance's biochemistry, were generated by the biochemical interactions the consumption introduced into the human organism's neural architecture. The changes were sustained by the substance's continued provision, were maintained by the ongoing supply the addiction required and the civilization's systems depended on. The changes were also the vulnerabilities. The consciousness the substance expanded was the consciousness the substance made dependent. The capabilities the substance developed were the capabilities the substance made supply contingent. The civilization the substance enabled was the civilization the substance made fragile. The duality, the changes and the vulnerabilities, the expansions and the dependencies, the capabilities and the fragilities was the spice's defining character. The substance was both, was simultaneously the civilization's foundation and the civilization's weakness, was at once the thing that made the civilization possible and the thing that made the civilization vulnerable. The duality was Herbert's argument. The argument said, the resources that enable the civilizations also constrain them. The dependencies that sustain the civilizations also threaten them. The substances that change the species also bind the species. The changes and the bindings are inseparable, are the two dimensions of the same relationship between the species and the substance the species depends on. The argument was about the spice. The argument was about the species. The argument was about the reader's civilization. The argument was about the dependencies the reader's civilization was building, and the vulnerabilities the dependencies were producing, and the fragilities the vulnerabilities were creating. The spice melange, the substance that changed humanity, the substance that sustained the civilization, the substance that created the vulnerability, the substance that was produced by the worms on one desert world, that was consumed across hundreds of worlds by populations whose addiction was permanent and whose dependency was structural, the substance that held the universe together, the substance whose absence would have torn the universe apart, the most important substance in the history of the human species, the melange, the spice, the thing everything depended on, the thing the civilization could not live without, the thing the civilization could not remain safe with, the substance, the dependency, the vulnerability. The story of the spice was the story of everything. The sapho juice was the spice's mentat preparation, the derivative whose biochemical properties were calibrated to the cognitive enhancement the mentat function required. The juice was derived from the melange. The preparation, the processing that converted the raw spice's biochemistry into the form the mentat tradition's consumption employed, was the preparation that tailored the substance's effects to the computational function the mentat training developed. The processing was institutional, was conducted through the methods the mentat tradition maintained for the preparation's production, was managed by the tradition's institutional apparatus for the quality the mentat consumption required. The sapho juice's effects were the effects the mentat function demanded, the sustained analytical enhancement the computation required, the cognitive sharpness the processing sustained, the mental acuity the mentat's operational mode depended on. The effects were narrower than the raw spice's effects, were calibrated to the computational dimension rather than to the comprehensive enhancement the raw consumption produced. The calibration was the preparation's purpose, the tailoring of the substance's biochemistry to the function the tradition's practitioners required. The juice stained the lips, the physical marker, the discoloration the sustained consumption produced in the oral tissues the consumption contacted was the sapho juice's most visible physical indicator. The staining was the addiction's signature, the visible evidence of the sustained consumption the mentat function required and the dependency the consumption established. The staining was Peter de Vries's most documented physical characteristic, the visual marker the saga's narrative identified as the Harkonnen mentat's most visible feature. The staining was also present in every mentat whose consumption the narrative documented, was the universal physical indicator the sustained sapho consumption generated in the practitioners whose cognitive function the consumption supported. The sapho juice demonstrated the spice's adaptability, the substance's capacity for the preparation's modification into the forms the institutional function's varying requirements demanded. The raw spice produced the comprehensive enhancement. The sapho juice produced the computational enhancement. The water of life produced the consciousness transformation. The preparations were the substance's variations, the different forms the biochemistry's processing could produce from the same raw material. The variations demonstrated that the spice was not a single substance in the functional sense, was not a compound whose effects were fixed by the compound's chemistry. The spice was a family of substances. Was the raw material from which the preparations processing could produce the compounds, the institutional functions, varying requirements specified. The family's members shared the raw material's biochemistry. The family's members differed in the processing's modifications. The differences were the preparation's products, were generated by the processing that converted the raw material into the forms the function's demands required. The spice's role in each novel the saga encompassed was the role that connected the substance to the events the novels documented, the thread that ran through every narrative the saga contained, present in every era, consequential in every dimension. In Dune, the spice was the prize. The substance whose control the Arrakis fief assignment provided was the economic motivation the conspiracy was organized around, the revenue the Harkonnens had generated across 80 years of governance, the economic opportunity the Atreides transfer was supposed to provide, the wealth the Baron's recovery of the fief was designed to restore. The spice was also the ecological context, the substance whose production the desert ecology generated and whose availability the environmental conditions the Fremen inhabited provided. Paul's encounter with the spice was the encounter that activated the genetic potential the breeding program had produced. The environmental spice saturation the desert provided, the sustained, comprehensive, environmentally imposed melange exposure the Fremen existence encompassed was the biochemical condition that facilitated the prescient faculty's development. Paul's transformation from the Caladan air to the Kwisatz Haderach was facilitated by the spice, was supported by the biochemistry the environmental exposure provided alongside the genetics the breeding program had contributed. Paul's threat to destroy the spice was the novel's political climax in the substance's dimension, the moment at which the spice's civilizational leverage was demonstrated in its most concentrated form. The threat was the leverage's deployment, the use of the substance's indispensability as the political instrument the military victory's terms required. In Dune Messiah, the spice was the governance's economic foundation. The production that Paul's governance managed, the harvesting operations that continued on the Arrakis the governance controlled, was the economic activity that funded the institutional operations the governance maintained. The spice was also the prescient consciousness's sustainer, the substance whose continued consumption maintained the prescient faculty the governance's strategic dimension depended on. The conspiracy's relationship with the spice was the relationship of the institutional actors whose interests the spice's management affected. The guild's participation was motivated by the spice control's implications, by the leverage Paul's personal control of the supply gave the Emperor over the institution whose survival the supply's reliability sustained. Irulan's contraceptive administration operated within the domestic sphere the spice governance's political dynamics produced. In Children of Dune, the spice was the ecological crisis's subject. The terraforming program's progress, the progressive modification of the desert conditions the spice production required, was the threat the substance's continued production faced. The crisis connected the ecological trajectory to the political dynamics, connected the desert's transformation to the political instability the transformation's implications produced. Leto II's transformation was connected to the spice through the sand trout symbiosis. The larval organisms that covered the child's body, the creatures whose life cycle included the spice production's ecological mechanisms, were the biological interface through which Leto's consciousness was connected to the ecology the spice was produced by. The symbiosis was the connection, the biological link between the consciousness that would govern and the ecology the governance would manage. In God Emperor of Dune, the spice was the managed resource. Leto II's comprehensive governance included the spice production's comprehensive management, the personal control of the supply, the calibrated distribution, the ecological management that production's continuation demanded. The spice was the governance's economic tool, was deployed in service of the Golden Path's political requirements through the distribution's calibrated management. The spice's availability during the God-Emperor period was the availability the governance's management determined, was provided at the levels the governance specified rather than at the levels the market's dynamics generated. The management was authoritarian. The management was also the most ecologically informed management the production had received, the management that maintained the ecological conditions the production required alongside the political conditions the governance demanded. In Heretics of Dune, the spice was the recovered supply. The sandworm ecology's regeneration, driven by the sand trout from the God-Emperor's body, was producing the spice the post-famine time civilization's reduced demands required. The spice was also the motivator for the chapter house transplantation, the substance whose institutional importance drove the Bene Gesserit's decision to establish the sandworm ecology on a second world. In Chapter House Dune, the spice was the transplanted ecology's promise. The sandworms introduced to Chapter House were producing the desert conditions the spice production required, were progressively establishing the ecological system whose operation would eventually generate the melange the sisterhood's institutional consumption demanded. The spice was also the cargo Shiana carried, the ecological foundation the no-ship transported into the unknown territories. The thread across the novels was continuous. The spice was present in every novel. The spice was consequential in every novel. The thread was the substance's sustained presence across the saga's full timeline, the narrative constancy that connected the novel's varying eras into the continuous story the saga constituted. The breeding program's spice dimension was the dimension that connected the genetic management the Bene Gesserit conducted to the biochemical substance the genetic potential's activation depended on. The breeding program's objective, the production of the Kwisatz Haderach, was the objective that required the spice for the objective's realization. The genetic potential the program was designed to produce was the potential the spice would activate, was the dormant capability the genetics contained, and that the substance's consumption would convert into the operational form the capability's exercise required. The program and the substance were complementary. The program produced the potential. The substance activated the potential. The production and the activation were both necessary. The potential without the activation was dormant. The activation without the potential was ineffective. The complementarity connected the program's genetic dimension to the substance's biochemical dimension, connected the 90 generations of managed reproduction to the ecological conditions of a single desert planet. The connection was the program's ecological dependency. The program that had been managed for 90 generations, that had been conducted across the millennia of the sisterhood's institutional operation, that had consumed the institutional resources the management required, was a program whose culmination depended on the ecological conditions a single planet maintained. The culmination, the Kwisatz Haderach's activation, required the spice. The spice required the ecology. The ecology required the desert. The 90-generation program's culmination was contingent on the desert's continuation. The contingency was the program's vulnerability. The program could manage the genetics, could direct the reproductive configurations the generations produced, could maintain the genetic management the culmination's preparation required. The program could not manage the ecology, could not control the desert conditions the spice production depended on, could not guarantee the ecological system the activation's biochemistry required. The vulnerability was not addressed. The Bene Gesserit's institutional management of the breeding program did not include the ecological management the vulnerability demanded, did not include the attention to the desert conditions the spice production's continuation required, did not encompass the ecological dimension the program's culmination depended on. The non-address was characteristic of the Imperium's relationship with the ecology the spice depended on. The institutions that consumed the spice, the guild, the Bene Gesserit, the noble houses, the governance, consumed the substance without managing the ecology the consumption depended on. The consumption was managed. The ecology was not. The management's ecological gap was the gap the consumption's institutional consumers did not address. The spice's social stratification, the distribution of the substance's benefits across the population in proportion to the population's wealth, was the dimension that connected the substance's biochemistry to the Imperium's social architecture. The stratification was comprehensive. The wealthy consumed the spice at the levels the enhancement's most consequential effects required. The poor consumed the spice at the levels the enhancement's most modest effects permitted, or did not consume the spice at all. The differential was the substance's social product, the production, through the consumption's economic distribution. Of a society whose members' capabilities were determined by the members' economic access to the substance the capabilities depended on. The longevity differential was the stratification's most visible expression. The rulers who consumed the spice lived for centuries. The governed who did not consume the spice lived for decades. The differential was the substance's temporal inequality, the production, through the consumption's differential distribution, of a society in which some members had centuries of experience and others had decades. The temporal inequality's political consequences were the consequences that shaped the governance's character across the Imperium's history. The rulers whose centuries of experience the spice provided were rulers whose political sophistication the longevity developed, rulers whose understanding of the political landscape was informed by the decades and the centuries of accumulated observation the extended lifespan permitted. The governed whose decades of experience the unassisted biology provided were governed persons whose political sophistication the limited lifespan constrained, governed persons whose understanding of the political landscape was bounded by the decades the biology permitted, whose accumulated observation was limited by the lifespan the unassisted biology provided. The disparity was the substance's contribution to the Imperium's class structure, the biochemical mechanism through which the ruling class's capabilities exceeded the governed class's capabilities by the margin the differential consumption produced. The disparity was not the only mechanism the class structure maintained. The class structure included the educational differentials, the resource differentials, the institutional access differentials the social architecture produced. But the disparity was the most biologically direct mechanism, the mechanism that operated through the body's biochemistry rather than through the society's institutions. The cognitive differential was the stratification's less visible but equally consequential expression. The rulers whose sustained consumption produced the cognitive enhancement were rulers whose analytical capabilities, perceptual acuity, and strategic assessment the enhancement supported. The governed whose limited or absent consumption did not produce the enhancement were governed persons whose cognitive capabilities operated at the unassisted baseline the biology provided. The cognitive disparity was the substance's contribution to the governance's quality, the biochemical mechanism through which the ruler's cognitive performance exceeded the governed's cognitive performance by the margin the differential consumption generated. The disparity supported the governance, provided the rulers with the cognitive advantages the governance's demands required, maintained the analytical capabilities the political landscape's complexity demanded. The disparity also constrained the governance, limited the govern's capacity for the assessment of the governance's quality, reduced the govern's analytical capability for the evaluation of the governance's decisions, diminished the govern's cognitive resources for the political participation the governance's accountability required. The constraint was the stratification's most consequential political effect, the effect that the substance's differential distribution produced in the governance's accountability dimension. The governance was less accountable because the governed were less capable of the assessment the accountability required. The governed were less capable because the substance the capability depended on was not available to the governed at the levels the capability required. The unavailability was the economy's product, was generated by the pricing that limited the consumption's access to the populations whose wealth the pricing's magnitude required. The spice trade's commercial mechanics were the mechanics that connected the harvesting operations on Arrakis to the consumers across the Imperium's commercial landscape. The trade operated through the CHOAM framework's commercial channels. The framework managed the trade's institutional dimensions, the pricing, the distribution, the quality management, the commercial relationships the trade's ongoing operation required. The management was institutional rather than spontaneous, was conducted through the framework's administrative apparatus rather than through the market's unmanaged dynamics. The trade's participants were the participants the framework's commercial structure encompassed. The producers, the harvesting operations on Arrakis, managed by the house the fief assignment designated, were the trade's supply-side participants. The consumers, the institutional populations, the noble houses, the governance's administrative apparatus, the guild's navigational operations were the trade's demand-side participants. The intermediaries, the commercial operators whose activities connected the production to the consumption through the distribution the transportation provided, were the trade's logistical participants. The trade's volume was the volume the demand's magnitude generated. The consumption's comprehensive character, the multiple institutional functions the consumption supported. The multiple populations the consumption served, the multiple effects the consumption produced, generated the demand the trade's volume reflected. The volume was large. The volume was sustained. The volume was the trade's most consequential commercial characteristic, the characteristic that made the trade the CHOAM framework's primary commercial activity. The trade's profitability was the profitability the substance's value generated. The spice's price, determined by the supply and demand dynamics the CHOAM framework's commercial management produced, was the price that reflected the substance's indispensability to the civilization's functioning. The price was high. The price's magnitude was the trade's profitability's source, was the revenue margin the substance's value generated for the trade's participants. The profitability's distribution across the trade's participants was the distribution the commercial relationships determined. The producers received the production's revenue, the income the harvesting operations output generated at the prices the CHOAM framework's market maintained. The intermediaries received the distribution's margins, the revenue the logistical services the distribution required generated. The CHOAM framework received the management's fees, the institutional income the framework's commercial management generated. The emperor received the taxation, the revenue the throne's fiscal authority extracted from the trade's commercial activity. The taxation was the governance's most consequential fiscal relationship with the spice trade, was the revenue the throne's institutional operations depended on, the income the governance's administrative apparatus required. The distribution was political as well as commercial. The commercial relationships the distribution encompassed were relationships whose participants' institutional interests the relationship's management affected. The management's decisions, the pricing, the allocation, the distribution's logistical management were decisions whose commercial consequences affected the political landscape's dynamics alongside the commercial landscape's markets. The spice's final argument was the argument the substance's full examination produced, the argument that the substance's story revealed about the relationship between human civilization and the resources the civilization depended on. The argument said, the resource shapes the civilization. The civilization that depends on the resource is the civilization whose architecture the resource's conditions determine, whose economic structures the resource's value organizes, whose political dynamics the resource's control generates, whose social stratification the resource's distribution produces. The argument said, the civilization shapes the resource. The civilization that depends on the resource is the civilization whose activities affect the resource's conditions, whose harvesting operations affect the production's ecology, whose governance affects the production's management, whose consumption affects the supply's adequacy. The argument said, the shaping is reciprocal. The resource shapes the civilization, and the civilization shapes the resource in the sustained interaction that dependency produces. The interaction is continuous. The interaction is consequential. The interaction is the relationship, the ongoing engagement between the civilization and the resource that the dependency constitutes. The reciprocity was the spice's story's deepest dimension. The substance shaped the civilization. The civilization's activities shaped the substance's production. The shaping and the shaped were engaged in the reciprocal relationship the dependency sustained. The relationship was the spice's story, was the ongoing, millennia-spanning engagement between the substance and the civilization the substance supported. The engagement was not finished. The saga's documented timeline ended with the engagement in progress, with the substance's civilizational role being challenged by the developments the later eras produced, with the dependency's persistence being addressed by the diversification, the transplantation, and the technological development were generating. The engagement continued beyond the documentation. The substance continued. The civilization continued. The relationship continued. The reciprocal shaping continued. The spice's story continued beyond the saga's telling, continued into the territories the documentation did not encompass, continued through the developments the documentation did not document. The spice melange, the substance that changed humanity, the substance that held the universe together, the substance whose story was the story of everything. The story was not finished. The substance was not exhausted. The dependency was being addressed. The civilization was adapting. The spice remained. The story continued. The spice's relationship with the saga's individual characters was the relationship that made the substance's story personal, that connected the civilizational argument to the individual experience, and that demonstrated the substance's effects through the persons whose lives the effects shaped. Duke Leto Atreides experienced the spice as the opportunity. The substance whose control the Arrakis fief assignment provided was the opportunity the Duke assessed through the governance tradition the Atreides household maintained, was evaluated as the economic and political asset the fief's management would provide. Leto's assessment was informed by the understanding the Atreides tradition brought to the governance's challenges. The recognition that the fief's management included the risks the desert's conditions imposed alongside the revenues the production's operation generated. Leto did not live long enough on Arrakis for the spice's personal effects to develop beyond the initial exposure. The Duke's governance, terminated by the Harkonnen assault within the first year of the Atreides' presence on Arrakis, was the governance that engaged with the spice as the commodity the governance administered, rather than as the substance the governor consumed at the levels the enhancement required. Leto's death was connected to the spice through the political dynamics the spice's value generated. The conspiracy that destroyed the Atreides, the Emperor's plot, the Baron's operational management. The Sardaukars' disguised participation was the conspiracy the spice's political significance motivated. The spice was the reason the conspiracy existed, was the economic prize whose control the conspiracy was designed to manage, was the substance whose political leverage the conspiracy's institutional actors were competing for. Jessica experienced the spice as the transformation, the substance whose consumption facilitated the spice agony's consciousness transformation was the substance that changed Jessica's capabilities from the Bene Gesserit's training's products to the Reverend Mother's expanded awareness. The Water of Life ordeal, Jessica's first attempt at the internal conversion, was the ordeal that the substance made possible, and that the substance's concentrated form required. Jessica's relationship with the spice was the relationship of the person whose consciousness the substance transformed, the relationship between the Bene Gesserit, whose training had prepared the capabilities, and the substance whose biochemistry activated the capabilities' most consequential dimension. The transformation was permanent. The consciousness that the ordeal produced was the consciousness Jessica would inhabit for the remainder of the lifespan the spice's longevity extension provided. Paul experienced the spice as the activation. The substance whose environmental saturation the desert provided was the substance that activated the genetic potential the breeding program had produced, the biochemical catalyst that converted the Kwisatz Haderach's dormant capability into the prescient awareness the capability's operational form constituted. Paul's relationship with the spice was the relationship of the person whose capabilities the substance activated, and whose awareness the substance sustained. The prescient consciousness that the activation produced was the consciousness the sustained consumption maintained, was dependent on the continued provision of the substance the consciousness's biochemistry required. The dependency was the relationship's binding dimension, the biochemical chain that connected Paul's most consequential capability to the substance's continued availability. The navigators experienced the spice as the transformation and the prison. The sustained high-concentration consumption that the navigational function required transformed the navigator's biology, produced the physiological changes the transformation encompassed, altered the consciousness the perception required, modified the physical form the ordinary human morphology maintained. The transformation was the spice's most comprehensive personal effect, the effect that changed the person's body alongside the person's consciousness. The prison was the transformation's irreversibility. The navigators who had been transformed could not return, could not reverse the physiological and the neurological modifications the sustained consumption had produced, could not restore the pre-transformation biology the ordinary human condition constituted. The navigators were imprisoned in the transformation, were held in the modified condition by the biochemistry's irreversibility and the addiction's lethality. The imprisonment was the spice's most personal cost, the cost the substance extracted from the persons whose transformation the substance produced. The navigators gave their bodies to the navigation. The navigation required the spice. The spice required the transformation. The transformation was permanent. The permanence was the prison. The Fremen's ceremonial relationship with the spice was the relationship that connected the substance's biochemistry to the cultural practices the desert civilization had developed across millennia of the substance's environmental presence. The Tau Orgi was the ceremonial consumption, the communal spice experience the Fremen's cultural traditions maintained for the community's spiritual and social functions. The ceremony involved the concentrated consumption of the spice in the forms the tradition specified, the communal ingestion that produced the enhanced awareness the ceremony's spiritual dimension utilized, and the communal bonding the ceremony's social dimension sustained. The ceremony's effects were the effects the concentrated consumption produced in the group, setting the communal consumption created. The enhanced awareness, the cognitive expansion the concentrated consumption generated, was experienced communally rather than individually, was shared among the ceremony's participants through the psychological dynamics the communal setting produced. The sharing was the ceremony's social function, the mechanism through which the community's members' enhanced awareness was experienced as the collective awareness the community's cohesion depended on. The Sayadina's role in the ceremony was the role of the spiritual practitioner whose training included the management of the concentrated consumption's effects. The guidance of the community's enhanced awareness through the spiritual dimensions the ceremony's tradition specified. The Sayadina was the ceremony's conductor, the person whose capabilities directed the collective experience the communal consumption produced. The Reverend Mother's transformation changed the ceremony's character. When Jessica underwent the spice agony and became the Reverend Mother, when the consciousness transformation the Water of Life's conversion produced was added to the ceremony's spiritual resources, the ceremony's capabilities were expanded by the Reverend Mother's expanded awareness. The transformation added the other memory's depth to the ceremony's spiritual dimension, added the ancestral presence's accumulated wisdom to the collective awareness the communal consumption generated. The ceremonial dimension was the spice's cultural expression. The form the substance took in the civilization, the substance was produced within. The Fremen did not simply consume the spice. The Fremen ritualized the consumption, converted the biochemical experience into the cultural practice the ritual constituted, maintained the ritual's traditions across the generations the practice's cultural transmission sustained. The ritualization was the civilization's relationship with the substance expressed in the cultural form, the conversion of the biochemical interaction into the spiritual practice, the transformation of the consumption into the ceremony, the elevation of the pharmacological into the sacred. The conversion was the Fremen's cultural achievement, the production of meaning from the substance the ecology provided, the creation of the spiritual significance the biochemistry's effects could be invested with. The spice's sensory presence in the desert was the presence that the environmental saturation produced in the Arrakis ecology's daily reality, the ongoing, sustained, pervasive presence of the substance in the conditions the desert's inhabitants experienced. The air carried the spice. The desert's atmosphere contained the melange's particles. The airborne concentration the life cycle's biological processes released into the atmospheric medium the desert's conditions maintained. The atmospheric concentration was the environmental exposure's primary mechanism, was the medium through which the sustained, comprehensive, involuntary consumption the Fremen's existence encompassed was conducted. The breathing was the consumption. Every breath the desert's inhabitants drew was the breath that included the spice's atmospheric concentration, the inhalation that introduced the substance's biochemistry into the organism's respiratory system, the respiratory exposure that contributed to the sustained consumption the environmental saturation produced. The sand carried the spice, the desert's medium, the granular material the surface consisted of, the sand the worms moved through, the ground the inhabitants walked on, contained the Melange's deposits the life cycle's processes generated. The contact was the exposure, the physical interaction with the substance-containing medium that contributed to the sustained consumption the environmental presence produced. The food carried the spice. The diet the desert's conditions provided, the nourishment the Fremen's food sources generated in the spice, permeated ecology, contained the Melange's biochemistry at the concentrations the ecology's saturation produced. The dietary consumption was the consumption the nutrition's medium provided, the ingestion that introduced the substance's biochemistry through the digestive system's processing. The pervasiveness was the environmental exposure's defining quality. The substance was present in every dimension of the desert's sensory environment, was present in the air, in the sand, in the food, in the conditions the daily existence was conducted in. The pervasiveness made the exposure unavoidable, made the consumption the consequence of the existence rather than the product of the choice, made the addiction the environment's imposition rather than the individual's decision. The pervasiveness was also the enhancement source, the Fremen's cognitive capabilities, the perceptual acuity, the reflexive responsiveness, the awareness the desert's conditions demanded and the spice's biochemistry supported, were the capabilities the pervasive exposure's sustained consumption produced. The Fremen were enhanced because the Fremen inhabited the substance. The inhabiting was the enhancement's mechanism. The mechanism was environmental rather than institutional. The environmental mechanism's contrast with the institutional mechanism was the contrast the saga's argument about the spice encompassed. The institutional consumption, the mentat's sappho juice. The navigator's concentrated intake, the Bene Gesserit's managed provision, was the consumption the institutional purpose directed, the consumption whose levels and whose forms the institutional requirements specified. The environmental consumption, the Fremen's atmospheric and dietary intake, was the consumption the environment imposed, the consumption whose levels and whose forms the ecology's conditions determined. The two mechanisms produced different relationships with the substance. The institutional consumers related to the spice as the tool, as the substance the institutional function required, consumed at the levels the function specified, managed through the institutional apparatus the consumption's administration maintained. The Fremen related to the spice as the environment, as the substance the existence encompassed, consumed through the conditions the ecology imposed. Experienced as the dimension of the daily life the desert's conditions constituted, the difference was the difference between using and inhabiting. The institutional consumers used the spice, the Fremen inhabited the spice. The using was the instrumental relationship. The inhabiting was the existential relationship. The two relationships were both the substance's relationships with the persons who consumed it, were both the dimensions of the engagement between the substance and the consciousness the consumption affected. The spice cycle, the complete ecological loop through which the substance was produced, consumed, and ecologically recycled, was the cycle that connected the substance's biology to the substance's economy, to the substance's ecology in the comprehensive loop the life cycle's operation constituted. The cycle began with the sand trout, the larval organism's water encapsulation, the ecological function that maintained the desert conditions the adult worms required, was the cycle's initiating process. The process produced the conditions supported the worms produced the spice was collected by the harvesters distributed the spice through the commercial channels delivered the spice to the consumers. The consumers consumed the spice. The consumption sustained the institutional functions the civilization depended on. The cycle's biological dimension was the dimension the harvester's commercial dimension tapped into, the natural process whose output the commercial operations collected. The biological dimension was self-sustaining, operated through the organism's biological mechanisms without the human management the commercial dimension required. The self-sustaining character was the cycle's resilience, the quality that made the production continuous regardless of the commercial operations management. The cycle's commercial dimension was the dimension the civilization organized around the managed collection, distribution, and consumption that the CHOAM framework's institutional infrastructure administered. The commercial dimension was managed, was conducted through the institutional mechanisms the framework provided, was administered through the commercial channels the distribution maintained. The two dimensions, the biological and the commercial, were connected by the harvesting. The harvesting was the interface, the point at which the biological cycle's output was collected by the commercial cycle's operations, the mechanism through which the natural production was converted into the managed commodity. The interface was the vulnerability's location. The biological cycle was self-sustaining, could operate without the commercial cycle's intervention, could produce the spice regardless of whether the spice was collected. The commercial cycle was dependent, required the biological cycle's output for the commercial operations supply, could not operate without the biological production the commercial operations collected. The dependency ran one direction. The biology did not depend on the commerce. The commerce depended on the biology. The direction was the vulnerability's character, the character that made the commerce vulnerable to the biology's disruption, while the biology was immune to the commerce's disruption. The direction was the ecology's power. The ecology that produced the spice was the ecology whose disruption would disrupt the commerce, would eliminate the supply the commercial operations collected, would remove the substance the institutional consumption required. The ecology's disruption was the commerce's collapse. The relationship was asymmetric. The ecology was primary. The commerce was secondary. The asymmetry was the saga's ecological argument in its most direct form, the demonstration that the natural system's primacy over the managed system was the primacy the vulnerability's direction demonstrated. The managed system depended on the natural system. The dependence made the managed system vulnerable. The vulnerability was the managed system's most consequential quality. The political economy of the spice changed across the saga's eras in ways that reflected the political transformations the era's events produced, the modifications of the economic arrangement that the political changes generated. In the Corino era, the spice economy was managed through the CHOAM framework's commercial infrastructure under the dynasty's fiscal oversight. The management was institutional, was conducted through the commercial mechanisms the framework maintained, was administered through the fiscal arrangements the dynasty's taxation provided. The economy was stable, was maintained at the levels the consumption's sustained demand and the production's consistent operation supported. In Paul's era, the spice economy was managed through the governance's personal authority alongside the CHOAM framework's institutional operations. Paul's control of Arrakis, the governance's direct management of the planet the spice was produced on, changed the economy's administrative character from the institutional management the Corino era had maintained to the combined personal and institutional management Paul's governance provided. The jihad's economic disruption affected the economy, disrupted the commercial relationships the CHOAM framework maintained, affected the distribution channels the commerce operated through, changed the economic conditions the markets operated in. The disruption was the military operation's economic consequence. the economic effects the interstellar war's military activities generated alongside the military effects the activities were designed to produce. In the God Emperor's era, the spice economy was managed through the comprehensive governance's personal authority. The CHOAM framework's institutional mechanisms were subordinated to the governance's comprehensive management, were administered under the governance's authority rather than through the framework's independent operations. The economy was managed rather than marketed, was conducted through the governance's allocation rather than through the market's dynamics. In the post-God Emperor era, the spice economy was disrupted by the famine times supply shortage, was affected by the ecological transition that reduced the production's volumes and the distribution's reliability. The economy adapted, adjusted to the reduced supply, managed the shortage's consequences, operated in the conditions the reduced availability imposed. The economy's recovery, driven by the ecology's regeneration, restored the economic conditions the reduced civilization required. The recovery was gradual, was measured in the ecological timescales the regeneration's biology demanded, rather than in the economic timescales the commerce preferred. The political economy's progression across the eras was the progression from the institutional management, through the personal management, through the comprehensive management, through the disruption, through the recovery. The sequence of economic arrangements, the political transformations the era's events produced. The progression was the substance's political economy told as a story. The narrative of the economic arrangement's transformation across the millennia, the saga documented, shaped by the political events the eras produced and by the ecological conditions the events affected. The substance remained the same. The economics changed. The constancy of the substance and the variability of the economics were the relationship the political economy documented. The relationship between the thing that did not change and the arrangements the civilization built around the thing that did change. The substance was constant, the civilization was variable. The relationship between the constant and the variable was the spice's political economy's story. The spice Melange, the substance that changed humanity, the substance whose story was the story of everything the civilization built and everything the civilization risked. The story was told through the substance. The substance told the story. The melange, the most important substance in the history of the human species, the substance that made everything possible, the substance that made everything vulnerable. The story was the substance. The substance was the story. The spice, as the saga's metaphor for consciousness, was the dimension that connected the substance's biochemistry to the saga's deepest philosophical argument, the argument that consciousness was the human species' most consequential quality, and that the quality's relationship with its conditions determined the quality's expression. The metaphor operated through the parallel between the substance and the consciousness. The spice was produced by an ecology. The consciousness was produced by a biology. The spice was the ecology's product. The consciousness was the biology's product. The spice depended on the ecology's conditions. The consciousness depended on the biology's conditions. The parallel was structural, was the similarity in the relationship between the product and the conditions rather than in the product's properties. The parallel extended to the dependency dimension. The civilization depended on the spice. The person depended on the consciousness. The dependency was total in both cases. The civilization could not function without the spice. The person could not function without the consciousness. The dependency's totality made the dependency's object the most consequential element in the depending entity's architecture, made the spice the civilization's most important element, and the consciousness the person's most important element. The parallel extended further to the vulnerability dimension. The spice's production was vulnerable to the ecology's disruption. The consciousness's operation was vulnerable to the biology's disruption. The vulnerability was present in both cases. The spice could be lost through the ecology's destruction. The consciousness could be lost through the biology's damage. The vulnerability's presence, alongside the dependency's totality, was the combination that made the dependent entity fragile, made the civilization fragile through the spice's vulnerability, and made the person fragile through the consciousness's vulnerability. The metaphor's purpose was the connection between the civilizational argument about the spice and the personal argument about the consciousness. The saga argued about the spice. The civilization that depends on the substance is the civilization that must manage the substance's conditions for the substance's continued provision. The saga argued about the consciousness. The person who depends on the consciousness is the person who must manage the consciousness's conditions for the consciousness's continued operation. The management was the prohibition's mandate. The prohibition said, manage the consciousness. Develop the consciousness through the biological mechanisms the management can sustain. Do not delegate the consciousness's functions to the artificial alternatives the delegation would make the consciousness unnecessary for. The management was the consciousness's preservation, was the sustained attention to the consciousness's conditions that the consciousness's continued operation required. The spice's management parallel was the ecology's management. The civilization that depended on the spice had to manage the ecology the spice was produced by, had to maintain the conditions the ecology required for the production's continuation, had to attend to the biological systems the production depended on. The God Emperor's ecological management was the management's most comprehensive expression, was the sustained attention to the ecology's conditions that the production's continuation across the millennia required. The parallel between the consciousness's management and the ecology's management was the saga's deepest metaphorical argument, the argument that the consciousness and the ecology were analogous systems whose management required the same qualities: the sustained attention, the comprehensive understanding, the willingness to invest the resources the condition's maintenance demanded. The deep time perspective on the spice was the perspective that the saga's full timeline provided, the view of the substance's role across the millennia the documented events encompassed, the assessment of the substance's significance from the vantage the millennia's span provided. The perspective showed the constancy. The spice was present across every era. The substance's properties were unchanged across every transition. The melange was the same substance in the post-jihad, founding that it was in the chapter house period, was the same biochemistry, the same effects, the same dependencies across the millennia the timeline encompassed. The constancy was the substance's most consequential temporal quality. The civilizations changed, the governance changed, the institutions changed, the substance remained. The remaining was the constancy, the quality that made the substance the timeline's fixed point, the element whose stability provided the reference against which the civilization's changes were measured. The perspective showed the dependency's persistence. The dependency was present in every era, was maintained across every transition, was sustained by the combination of the addiction's biological permanence and the institutional consumption's ongoing requirements. The dependency was not reduced by the governance's changes. The dependency was not addressed by the institutional transformations. The dependency persisted because the dependency was structural, was embedded in the civilization's architecture at the level the governance's changes did not reach. The persistence across the millennia was the dependency's most sobering quality, the quality that demonstrated the dependency's resistance to the interventions the governance's changing forms represented. The Carino dynasty governed for 10,000 years. The dependency persisted. Paul governed for 12 years. The dependency persisted. The God Emperor governed for 3,500 years. The dependency persisted. The governance changed. The dependency did not. The perspective showed the vulnerability's permanence, the vulnerability that the dependency produced, the civilization's susceptibility to the production's disruption, the navigational and economic system's fragility in the face of the supply's reduction, was the vulnerability maintained across every era the timeline encompassed. The vulnerability was not addressed by the governance's changes. The vulnerability was present in every era. The vulnerability was the dependency's companion, was maintained alongside the dependency across the millennia. The dependency persisted through. The deep time perspective was the perspective that revealed the substance's civilizational role in its fullest dimensions, showed the constancy, the persistence, the permanence that the individual era's focused views did not encompass. The perspective was the assessment that the millennia provided, the evaluation of the substance's significance from the vantage that the full timeline span made available. The spice's relationship with the Imperium's military dimension was the relationship that connected the substance to the warfare the Imperium's political dynamics produced, the connection between the biochemistry and the combat the politics generated. The military consumed the spice. The commanders whose strategic assessments the spice's cognitive enhancement supported, the soldiers whose combat capability the enhancement sustained, the military intelligence operatives whose analytical processing the enhancement facilitated. All were consumers whose military effectiveness the consumption contributed to. The consumption's military dimension was the dimension that connected the substance's cognitive enhancement to the combat's operational requirements. The enhancement supported the military functions, provided the cognitive acuity the strategic assessment demanded, sustained the perceptual sharpness the combat's reflexive requirements imposed, maintained the analytical capability the intelligence processing required. The military dependency was another dimension of the civilizational dependency, another institutional function whose operation depended on the substance's continued provision. Another element of the civilization's architecture whose maintenance was contingent on the supply's reliability. The Sardaukar consumed the spice. The Emperor's military force, the soldiers whose environmental hardening on Seleucia Secundus was supplemented by the cognitive enhancement the spice consumption provided, were consumers whose military capabilities the consumption sustained alongside the environmental conditioning's products. The Fremen's military superiority included the spice dimension, the desert warriors whose combat effectiveness exceeded the Sardaukars, whose individual capability surpassed the Imperium's most demanding military traditions products, were warriors whose capabilities included the environmental spice saturation's cognitive enhancement alongside the desert's environmental hardening. The superiority was the combination. The product of the environmental hardening and the environmental spice enhancement operating together to produce the combat effectiveness no other military tradition could match. The combination was the desert's gift. The same environment that hardened the warriors also enhanced them. The same ecology that produced the physical resilience also produced the cognitive enhancement through the spice saturation the ecology maintained. The hardening and the enhancement were both the environment's products, were both generated by the conditions the desert imposed on the persons the conditions encompassed. The spice's presence in the saga's imagery was the presence that the substance's pervasive significance produced in the narrative's visual and sensory descriptions, the descriptions that made the substance's reality tangible in the reading experience the narrative provided. The cinnamon colour was the imagery's foundation, the warm, amber-brown hue the descriptions attributed to the substance, the colour that identified the melange in the commercial and the ceremonial contexts the narrative documented was the visual element the substance's presence was rendered through. The colour appeared in the sand where the deposits accumulated, in the preparations the consumption's various forms employed, in the atmospheric haze the environmental concentration produced. The blue within blue eyes were the imagery's human expression. The ocular discoloration the sustained consumption produced, the modification of the eye's colouring that the spice's biochemistry generated in the persons whose consumption exceeded the levels the discoloration required, was the visual marker that identified the addicted persons in the narrative's populated landscapes. The eyes were the addiction's signature, the physical evidence, rendered in the sensory dimension the narrative could describe, of the biochemical condition the consumption had established. The fragrance was the imagery's olfactory element. The scent the descriptions compared to cinnamon, the aromatic quality the substance's presence produced in the air and in the preparations the consumption employed, was the sensory element that made the substance's presence perceptible through the olfactory dimension the narrative's descriptions could invoke. The imagery was the narrative's method for making the substance real, for converting the biochemical argument the substance embodied into the sensory experience the reading's imagination could produce. The colour, the eyes, the fragrance, these were the elements through which the substance's abstract significance was made concrete, through which the civilizational argument was given the tangible form the narrative's communication required. The spice's final meditation was the meditation the substance's full examination produced, the contemplation that the examination's comprehensive scope generated in the consciousness that conducted it. The meditation was about dependency. The substance that made everything possible was the substance that made everything vulnerable. The possibility and the vulnerability were inseparable, were the two dimensions of the same relationship, produced by the same consumption, sustained by the same biochemistry. The meditation contemplated the inseparability, considered the relationship between the enabling and the constraining, between the expanding and the binding, between the capability and the limitation the same substance produced. The meditation was about ecology. The substance that the civilization depended on was the substance the ecology produced. The civilization and the ecology were connected through the substance, were linked by the biochemistry the ecology generated and the civilization consumed. The meditation contemplated the connection, considered the relationship between the civilization's needs and the ecology's conditions, between the consumption's demands and the production's operations, between the managed system and the natural system the managed system depended on. The meditation was about consciousness. The substance that expanded consciousness was the substance that made consciousness vulnerable. The expansion and the vulnerability were both the substance's products, were both generated by the biochemistry the consumption introduced, were both consequences of the relationship between the substance and the consciousness the substance affected. The meditation contemplated the relationship, considered the engagement between the consciousness and the substance that enhanced it, between the awareness and the biochemistry that developed it, between the mind and the melange the mind depended on. The meditation was about the species. The substance that changed humanity was the substance the species organized its civilization around. The substance whose properties shaped the civilization's architecture, whose availability determined the civilization's functioning, whose vulnerability constrained the civilization's security. The meditation contemplated the species' relationship with the substance, considered what the relationship revealed about the species' nature, about the species' capacity for the dependencies the species' creativity generated, about the species' vulnerability to the conditions the species' dependencies produced. The contemplation was the substance's gift to the reader. The substance whose fictional properties the saga described was the substance whose contemplation the saga invited. The contemplation of the dependencies, the ecologies, the vulnerabilities, the consciousness that the substance's examination encompassed. The spice melange, the substance that changed humanity, the substance that held the universe together, the substance whose story was the story of everything the civilization built on the substance's foundation. The foundation was biochemical, the building was civilizational, the vulnerability was ecological. The story was the relationship among the three, the melange. One substance held the universe together. The substance's story revealed what the holding cost. The cost was the dependency. The dependency was the vulnerability. The vulnerability was the story. The spice. The story. The cost. The substance that changed humanity.